Chapter 31, Hexcon 3, Fairy Tales. Chapter text, Paramilitary Parameters. The news reports later were slightly confused. The official report said that rumors of a gun battle were wrong, and it was just the bomb and the bodyguards of the Minister of Information shooting. What were they shooting at? The news had no clue. Before the Obliviators got to work, the situation was far more dire than what eventually got reported. Even from a couple blocks away, the explosion was loud. Humans aren't designed to respond to something like that. In nature, that kind of noise is a volcano, a stampede, or an avalanche. Your lizard brain doesn't make the logical assumption that there's probably one bomb, and it's over. It says that the rocks are about to fall, and you need to run. In this case, the human reaction was probably smarter than the wizard reaction. The vast majority of the uninjured were clearing out, an onrushing tide of humanity that I had to fight through. I'd been near and caused enough explosions that the noise barely registered. Maybe it was too late, but maybe I could also do something to help. And then the shooting started. Ahead, the motorcade had actually stopped short, as suspicious of the unscheduled road construction as I'd been. Only the first few cars were damaged, and I could make out injured but living men in dark suits crawling out. Though it hadn't taken out the central car, it had effectively dead-ended the street, and the fleeing pedestrians made backing up impossible. Men with handguns drawn were surrounding the central car, looking for threats, and those threats materialized, literally. The crack of apparition is distinctive, even after a bomb going off, especially when each wizard is side-alonging two armed men, displacing a huge volume of air. Militants probably couldn't have loitered usefully in downtown Cairo for long with assault rifles, but magic could bring the fighters directly to the front line in an instant. If the Egyptian magical government wouldn't have been that concerned about supplying terrorists with potions, they almost certainly would think differently about teleporting into a firefight in broad daylight. Well, if they were going to break the rules first, just to cover my butt, I glanced to my right and was pleased to see that Alice Longbottom, British aura, wasn't too far behind me. "They have wizards," I shouted at her. The poor witch who'd signed up for a day of learning about Muggle government and maybe hanging out with teen girls at a department store visibly slid all the way into aura mode and yelled back, "Damn it, Dresden. Just try to be as discreet as possible." Clearly, nobody else in the Order of the Phoenix was surprised by my methodology at this point. I nodded and drew my blasting rod from its space-expanded sheath that looked like maybe a flashlight holster on my belt. Annoyingly, that little development had taken months, and making one for my staff was proving extremely difficult. It was hard to make a wizard space, 7 feet deep, in a small form factor in the first place, and all the enchantments on my staff made it even more unstable and difficult to get right. I realized Michael didn't have his sword, either. It was hard to be a guy with a giant weapon who sometimes needed to have a fight in public. Elaine had always mocked me about overcompensating. But I was at least one focus up over my fight a couple months earlier with the basilisk when I'd had to leave both staff and rod at home. Unfortunately, most of my non-lethal options were on the staff. Dangerous times, though, required desperate measures. I slowed to a stop, lined up on the nearest man with a rifle, shook out my shield bracelet in case this drew attention, and yelled, "Reducto." The reductor curse is hard on objects, but won't trigger if it hits a person, so I wasn't being nearly as negligent as I could have been. I doubt the guy appreciated that much as rifle shrapnel crunched into his chest and arms. At least it mostly blew away from his body and not into his face. Behind him, the wizard that had brought the guy in had been lining up his own attempts to use magic to tear open the central car, but turned when he recognized the incantation and started firing spells at me. And I was glad I was putting a lot into my shield, because the second gunman he'd brought also turned his rifle on me. Curses and bullets hit my shield, and I was sweating a little with the strain of keeping it large enough that anything that missed me wouldn't go flying into the crowds behind. I didn't have to hold it for long, though. All my friends with shorter legs weren't that far behind me. Mr. Weasley and Oliver were first, and started rocketing stunners at the opponents, taking out the second gunman and forcing the wizard to shield and start worrying about being outnumbered. Across the street, Michael finally caught up and simply dive-tackled one of the other gunmen from behind. That might not have been a great idea, with the other gunmen around, but at that point, Mrs. Longbottom appeared right next to him with a quieter crack of displaced air and started firing. I really needed to practice combat apparition more, because running is exhausting. Fortunately, the bodyguards seemed to recognize that we were reinforcements for them and not for the attackers, and we started driving the wizards back and taking out gunmen. Michael gave a distasteful look at the rifle he'd wrestled away from the guy he tackled, but couldn't seem to justify tossing it away and being unarmed. He notably didn't start shooting with it, though, instead using it as a club. Then suddenly, as if getting a radio broadcast from a higher power, his head snapped back the way he'd come and he growled, "This is a distraction." "Hell of a distraction," I told him, having reached his position on the other side of the street. "Pratigo," I incanted, shielding us against potshots while he tried to focus on whatever sixth sense he was using. "What's that way?" he asked, pointing at an angle basically due northwest. I tried to visualize the things we'd looked at that day and listed: the university campus, Tahrir Square, bunch of hotels, the river, big bridge over the river, wait, the Egyptian museum. His eyes lit up in some kind of recognition at the last, and I groaned. "This is cover," I yelled to my friends. "They're going after something at the museum." I took a moment to get a bigger picture. The gunmen were mostly all accounted for, and the enemy wizards were getting pushed back. Penny had stopped at the first bystander that had been caught in the explosion and was furiously casting healing charms while Percy covered her. Oliver, Alexis, and Mathilda were spread out at my flanks, shielding and firing stunners when they saw an opportunity, and our chaperones were moving through the fray like the war veterans they both were. Do not take your eyes off Arthur Weasley, mild-mannered bureaucrat by day, extremely brutal counter-terrorist fighter by night. I wasn't even sure what he cast at one of the wizards, but the guy went down hard after it managed to power through the guy's shield. Michael seemed equally impressed. "I thought I said not to be here today," he chided, half-heartedly. "You're welcome," I grinned. Glacious. I managed to get a distracted wizard to walk onto the patch of ice and slip, Mrs. Longbottom quickly finishing him off. "I have to admit, this isn't the behavior I've come to expect from wizards," he nodded, starting to head off toward the museum. "Yeah, we're pretty awesome," I told him. "Also, a taxi service." "Nope," Mathilda said, welding herself to my side in a fierce hug. She hadn't quite figured out apparating herself, but I'd been practicing my side along with her. "Lexi, take Michael," Mrs. Longbottom yelled back. "No, Merlin's hairy balls. You're going to make me go grey by the end of the day." "I'll take him. Arthur, can you handle the Egyptian ministry when they show up?" "Okay." As she hustled over, she looked for a second like she was going to try to order Mathilda to stay behind, saw her affixed like a limpet to me, and sighed. "Fine, Oliver or Alexis. The other stays here to help." "I'm the better healer," Oliver admitted. He'd had to figure out several of the charms to deal with Quidditch injuries from how hard he made people train. "Right, museum. With me, Mr. Carpenter." Warily, Michael took the small woman's proffered arm. Maybe he would have argued, but he probably didn't feel up to trying to run the half-mile back to the museum. "Exit through the gift shop," I suggested. Everyone nodded. I took a breath, called to mind what I needed to do to not splinch me and my girlfriend. I usually used my staff for the boost, but 1,000 yards shouldn't be a problem. Deliberation, destination, and determination firmly fixed, I turned in place and dragged us along the veil between the world and the Never-Never, skating instantly through the intervening space. And I only knocked over one display of Horus-eye necklaces when I landed. "Fingers, check. Ears, check. Shoes, check," Mathilda announced, after detaching herself and making sure she hadn't been splinched. "Sorry about the back of your hair, though," I winced, then stuck my tongue out and winked when she frantically felt the back of her head and realized I'd been messing with her. I looked around and confirmed that we'd gotten lucky. The gift shop was momentarily empty of shoppers, just one cashier giving us a 1,000-yard stare like a couple of teens teleporting into the building wasn't the weirdest thing she'd seen in her time there. A moment later, two more small explosions heralded the arrival of Alexis, Mrs. Longbottom, and Michael. They didn't knock over anything. The poor, beleaguered retail worker just rubbed her eyes and wandered off to rearrange a display somewhere else. "Your show. Where do we?" Mrs. Longbottom started to tell Michael before the sound of screams from the museum became apparent. Never mind. We rushed out of the shop toward the noise and wound up in the large central atrium where the early afternoon crowd was thin, presumably because lunch was still happening. Those that were there were being menaced by a dozen spindly little men with pointed ears, clubs, and red hats who'd already smashed several security guards unconscious. You called it, Mathilda told me. Remember that they're extremely dangerous. Class XXX, not spell resistant. Beasts, not beings. Right. Similar to goblins, red caps had survived wizards by being ornery rather than immune to magic. Unlike goblins, they didn't have any legal protections. I really needed to figure out whether all intelligent creatures that didn't get classified as beings were safe to kill with magic without risking your own soul. This probably wasn't exactly the time to find out. These might be from the Never Never, I warned instead, so they might be even worse. There was one way to find out. Glacius. I incanted. That was the cue for the other three wizards to start blasting. Saving the rather more exhausting stunners for the moment, everyone was mostly making do with lower energy spells. Petrificus Totalis, Mathilda tried, while Alexis used Immobilis, and Mrs. Longbottom incanted Incarcerus. After flinging out the ropes, the short aura also tried combat apparition again to bottleneck the creatures, and Michael charged off deeper into the atrium, flipping out a large pocket knife. The iron content of the steel blade would probably be a very effective deterrent for true Fae. While they were far faster and scrappier than they looked, they'd obviously been expecting nothing worse than Muggle security guards and scared tourists. If your accuracy is decent and you start far enough away, ranged attacks beat melee pretty much every time. I guess I'm saying they brought a club to spell fight. I mean, Class XXX sounds scarier when you learn about them third year. Mathilda asked, while we made sure we had incapacitated all of them. They hadn't even gotten close, though one of them had nearly clipped Alexis with a thrown club, and Michael had kicked one out of his way as he ran past. When we'd secured the room and caught up to Michael, he looked worse than he had when he left, but not by much. A couple lines of blood scored his arms, and his shirt was cut open, revealing a tunic of fine-linked steel chainmail. His opponent was significantly more injured. The true she in the red cap we'd seen at Necropolis was shoved up against a column, Michael's arm leveraged against his chest, and his pocket knife at the Fae's throat. The guy had a few nasty cuts of his own that looked burned from the iron allergy. A pair of silvery hatchets were discarded on the floor nearby, and he'd lost the hat. It had left a bit of a red stain on the floor beneath where it had fallen during the fight. It was after that, Michael nodded at a display case without taking his eyes off his prisoner, whose arms hung in seeming surrender by his sides, but who had that typical mad Fae gleam in his eye. Good afternoon, Lefayson, the she told me with a feral grin. Call off your church night, let me finish my mission, and there will be favors owed. Continue impeding me, and I shall have to take it as an affront. He's not mine, I shrugged. I'm just tagging along here, but you certainly pissed his boss off. I figured, at least. Church night. I'd still been thinking the guy was just a really specialized American aura. Lefayson, Michael asked me, still not taking his eyes off, but managing to quirk an eyebrow at me anyway. My mom apparently had enough dealings with the Fae to get a nickname, I told him, slightly surprised that much information wasn't somehow caught up in the secrets I couldn't share. Not wise, he said. These things will forever try to get you under their thumb. I just shrugged. He wasn't wrong. Mrs. Longbottom and Alexis had been investigating the display case, which held hieroglyph-inscribed ceremonial golden shields from Tut's tomb, according to the note. I felt like I'd seen a couple of similar artifacts in the wizarding dig site, delicate gold in a curved shield, or maybe headstone, shaped with lots of negative space, figures defined by sections cut out of the shield. Why is this in a Muggle museum? Mrs. Longbottom asked, after running detection charms. It's highly magical, and I bet it does something really cool enough that Mavra was looking for another one in Abu Simbel, I suggested. The she that was now sporting hat hair had a hell of a poker face, but I thought I saw a twitch. Did you blow up a whole street just for a shot at that thing? I asked the guy. Just no, why not a win-win? He smirked. Now, are we trading answers for favors? I don't think we can hold him without killing him, I told Michael. I'm opposed to that outcome, the she nodded. Michael thought about it for a few moments, probably weighing whether he would prefer to just kill the guy. Your freedom for your oath to stay out of Egypt and cease attempts to obtain any artifacts currently therein for at least a year and a day, as well as a truthful and full answer to one question. What's the question? He asked. The knight thought about it for a second, then clearly nodded my way, ceding me the phrasing. I considered, then asked, what is the objective that requires you to patronize terrorists and try to claim that artifact? Damn, a truthful and full answer, yes. The captured Fae asked, then elaborated. The simple answer is that you already have guesses. We want to once again have the free access to this world that is currently denied us. That artifact is one of several possible shortcuts. The terrorism, well, involving ourselves in such concerns allows us to offer our help against it if we can come to an agreement with the temporal authorities. Shatter the veil as a fait accompli, or convince the wizards to shatter it for you so you'll stop causing trouble, I summarized. He merely gave me that mad grin. I believe we had a bargain. Michael nodded, releasing him. He quickly scooped his hat back onto his head and disappeared his hatchets under his shirt. A quick, calculating look, memorizing faces and planning his payback. Just because we had a bargain didn't mean he couldn't be vindictive. I had a thought and mentioned, you might hold off on spreading this story around, unless the queens were ready for the plan to be widely known and happy for you to be the messenger. A flicker of worry. Great. Maybe that meant he wouldn't immediately call down Maeve, and whatever other true Fae had made it into the world to try to ruin our year. His mad, smug grin froze a little, and he simply nodded. The family legacy continues, until I see you again. With that, he blurred, and there was a slight pop of air. It didn't feel exactly like apparition, but hopefully he was doing basically the same thing to leave the country in the quickest manner possible. All business, Michael turned to Mrs. Longbottom and asked, "You can get that thing somewhere safer." Before she could answer, I grinned and told him, "But it belongs in a museum." All three witches stared at me blankly. I'd only had time to make my friends watch Raiders. We hadn't gotten to Last Crusade yet. After a few seconds of dead silence, Michael sighed and told me, "So do you, Dr. Jones." I broke out in the biggest smile. Usually only Mathilda finished my pop culture references. He wouldn't give me a high five, though. Victorious Vacation, the aftermath, was a mess, but fortunately Longbottom and Weasley, British ministry employees at large, were able to smooth over our actions. While the Egyptian ministry officially didn't condone wizards using magic in front of muggles, even in a crisis, if they could just leave the scene, they admitted that it was already a pretty bad breach of the statute of secrecy that we hadn't really made any worse. I got the impression that their muggle government liaisons were pretty happy with us for jumping in to help, but actually praising us would have set a bad precedent. So they basically just quietly ignored us for the rest of our trip. Whatever the shield was in the museum, it quickly and quietly disappeared into Egypt's version of the Department of Mysteries. We were able to get in touch with Bill Weasley and tell him about it in time for him to get more of a look at the similar shield in Abu Simbel before the government strong-armed Gringotts into giving that one up too. Bill had come into Cairo for the last few days of our vacation, fresh off his stint guarding the secret chambers of the Giza pyramids, and we discussed it at lunch one day. The entire extended Weasley/Gryffindor/Order of the Phoenix Vacation Group was spread across multiple tables in the back of an American cafe that did acceptable hamburgers and fries. After a month in a foreign country, we'd all gotten a little bored of expanding our culinary horizons and were in the mood for something familiar. Michael had been invited and was clearly completely bemused by how quickly the Weasleys would make anyone into honorary family, even a mysterious muggle swordsman possibly on a mission from God. "I only have so many relevant diagnostics," Bill explained, gesturing with a French fry. "But I didn't find anything to disagree with your assumptions, Harry. And the other shield-type artifacts we've found have generally suited form to function, providing some kind of defensive effect. This one is providing some kind of wide-scale protection, not unlike a wardstone. I'm surprised it's not physically anchored in a temple or obelisk. Is moving both of them to the same vault going to weaken the overall protection?" I asked. I worried that if it was somehow shoring up the local veil, it needed to be distributed. "No," Bill shrugged. The one in the museum had clearly been moved around quite a bit. There's hints of some of the kind of deep, conceptual ties that powerful artifacts have. It might have been dangerous for them to leave the country, but moving around within it wouldn't be too bad. Frankly, I'm not sure it's actively doing much. It might just have enough invested meaning that it could be used in a ritual to try to weaken whatever it had originally been used for. Fair, I said, taking a drink of my real sugar Coke. I'm not actually sure the veil was erected until the Middle Ages. These could have been used for other national defensive magics, and it's just similar enough that it would work. Or the veil here could be tied into those old national wards. Mr. Weasley just shook his head. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around all of this. We've been focused on the threat of dark wizards, you know who in particular, for so long. I don't know if any of the wizarding nations are prepared to adapt to attacks from beings we literally think of as fairy tales. At the very least, Mrs. Longbottom suggested, we can put pressure on the Department of Mysteries to start taking this kind of thing seriously. Mr. Longbottom added, we might be able to spin it in a way they'll accept. Multiple attempts by dark wizards on these two shields, so we need to identify and protect any similar artifacts that they might go after in Britain. I think the Wisengamot will go for allocating a bit of funding for that. And we can tell Saul over in the Dam what he should really be looking for. Mrs. Weasley asked, Michael, is there anything else your people can do on your side of things? The big man shook his head. I'm more in the crisis management business. I don't exactly have a support staff like your lot. The very fact that I was sent here to thwart these attempts means that they could have been really bad. It could have just been because I was supposed to prevent the side effects of an army of the undead and magically augmented terrorism. I don't know if I'll keep getting orders to help with the Fae situation in general, or just if they try more really deadly distractions. So, I summarized, if we see you or another guy with a holy sword, we're probably running out of time to handle the problem with research. Pretty much, he shrugged. Sometimes I do take normal vacations. You should come visit. Mrs. Weasley gushed. We could put you up. Your kids would love to see a Quidditch match or a magical menagerie. Hanging out with him for one morning, she'd already dug up a huge amount of information about the stoic man's family and personal life. It would be a hard sell to my wife, he shrugged, but I'll see what I can do. All right, big brains, Oliver announced, grinning after having hatched a plan with the twins. You lot done mackin' a plan teasave the world. Only it's Quidditch o'clock and we're getting everyone on brooms this time. We should be able to field 2 full teams. Oh, such fun, Mrs. Weasley enthused. Michael, can you come watch? Thanks for the offer, Molly, but no. I've still got to get my equipment shipped home safely before my flight out tonight. Well, okay, but leave us your contact information, she insisted. We'll owl you once we're all home. Clearly not sold on owls showing up to his muggle home, he nonetheless complied in the face of Molly Weasley. Turned out he lived in the suburbs of Chicago. Small world. I left him details for Remus, Poe Box, and the phone number of the Grangers, which were probably more relevant to his situation and the closest thing I had to permanent muggle contact information at the time. Then there was nothing else to do beyond getting dragged off to the Broom Flying Fun Center and forced to play Quidditch. The Weasley kids realized they could field a full team of their own if the older brothers played as chasers, much to Percy's discomfiture. Oliver did the best he could putting together his own team, but running Draco as his seeker was the only option he had for anyone that really played Quidditch, though Alexis was an enthusiastic amateur. That left me and Mathilda as beaters and Penny and Hermione trying not to fall off their brooms as the other 2 chasers. Somehow, Neville and Luna proved that the 2 Muggle-born girls and me were better options. Neville really could fall off a broom that wasn't going faster than a walking pace, and Luna got distracted very quickly. Neville's little sister, Julia, was still too young to be in a full-on Quidditch game. We were awful and got thoroughly trounced by the Weasleys, while Oliver and Draco pulled their hair out at how bad the rest of us were. It was good times. A couple of days before we were supposed to head home, Luna's father showed up from whatever expedition he'd been on over the summer and invited everyone interested on a day trip to try to find the elusive crocodile men of the Nile. Fortunately, we didn't find any. I didn't think I was prepared to fight lizard people after everything else that month. Mr. Lovegood managed to corner me on the banks of the Nile during part of the trip, while everyone else was disembarking from the barge he'd chartered, and asked, "Mr. Dresden, is there any truth to the rumor that you and Sirius Black became bitter enemies during your stay at Azkaban prison?" "Wait, what?" I asked, confused. "I was there for a few hours, in minimum security. I don't think I came anywhere near the guy." He nodded a bit frenetically, his long silver hair bouncing across his shoulders. I thought as much, but good journalism insisted I confirm. "I suspect that the Rotfang conspiracy is floating that idea rather than admit that he's after you because of the more simple explanation that you know who needs to eliminate you as part of his shadow war against the fairies." None of that made much sense. If anything, given that my godmother and Lucius Malfoy worked for both of them, and Mavra had at least seemed to be double-dipping trying to kill me for Voldemort while stealing the shield for the Fae, I was a bit worried that the Winter Fae might be trying to help Voldemort in some way. Not that I could explain that, even if I wanted to, because of the gesh against revealing my godmother's secrets. But then I latched onto, "What do you mean he's after me?" "Oh, yes, I have it on good authority. He somehow got a copy of the Daily Prophet that featured your group picture, was heard to mutter, 'He's at Hogwarts,' then escaped the next day. After your activities of the last couple of years, as little as the administration wants to admit you've faced you-know-who on multiple occasions, it seems apparent to everyone that you're the obvious target of his top lieutenant." "Man," I sighed. Of course, having thwarted the last batch of Death Eaters, another one would escape out of prison to ruin my year. I was hoping for 1 year off from these guys. "Not to worry. I hear they're going to station Dementors around the school to prevent him access." I boggled at him, and he amended, "Wait, I don't mean not to worry. I mean it gets worse. I'm personally affronted. Luna is there. The Quibbler will be running a multi-part series about the dangers of Dementors to try to drum up public support." He began regaling me with information about Dementors that I was pretty sure only about a quarter of which was true. A deranged, escaped Death Eater coming after me. Dementors for my protection. I just wanted to have 1 quiet year. Was that too much to ask? Security theater, I should have figured out how to fly back from Egypt with the Grangers. Like cafeterias, there were only really a limited number of ways to do security checkpoints. So Britain's international portkey terminal wasn't that different than airport security, other than being in an actual castle somewhere on the island, with stone walls and tapestries in the traditional wizarding style. All translocation from outside the island was theoretically, who knew how many holes the system had, redirected to this one giant room full of runic arrays. Auras had sniper posts around the room in case someone obviously bad landed, and then everyone had to progress through a corridor that was doing other kinds of passive and active scans. Then I reached the declarations desk, where I had to turn over my foci and enchanted items to make sure they weren't some kind of contraband. I suspected, based on my understanding of the runes I saw on the scanning arrays, that there were a huge number of ways to sneak through. If I was willing to put the work in, I could probably make a container that showed as completely mundane, no matter what was inside. A little polyjuice into a non-problematic citizen, and any Death Eater could get in. But it wasn't that bad. No worse than airport security. The problem was that if I'd come in on a plane, there probably wouldn't be reporters waiting to ambush me. "Harry Dresden, can I call you Harry?" the witch asked, somehow managing to intercept me and drag me into a corner between the security desk and where I would pick my gear back up. She was tiny, with aggressively permed blonde hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and other sartorial choices that made her look like she was here to interview for a job in a 1950s steno pool. A green dictaquill and piece of parchment floated beside her, ready to take transcription. Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet, and Teen Witch Weekly. And I assure you that both of my publications are very interested in you. Now, Harry, let's start off with a soft quaffle. Any chance that, as some readers have speculated, Sirius Black might be your father? "That's your softball?" I asked, vaguely feeling like we'd skipped the part where I agreed to be interviewed. But no, even if I wasn't sure who my father was, wasn't Black still at Hogwarts in 75? And I think my mother left before he even attended. Obviously, they probably knew each other if she was over at my godmother's house all summer, but I wasn't going to explain that to a reporter. To try to distract her, I said, I also never met him at Azkaban. I know that's a rumor, too. I was only there a few hours, and it was a misunderstanding. Somehow, the rest of my friends had been delayed coming through security or were already out in the next atrium, so there was no rescue coming as she asked her next question. Interesting. So why do you think this dark wizard is after you? I shrugged. Have they proven that he's after me for sure? Have they even proven that he actually said, he's at Hogwarts? Honestly, even if he did, maybe it was because he thought Voldemort, startled gasp from the reporter, was still there. After all, I've banished him from the school twice now. A serious claim. The wizarding world is certain that you know who is dead nearly a dozen years. Defeated, not dead. I shook my head. Did they ever even find his body? I kind of feel like the country was so excited the war was over that they didn't do enough to prepare for the next time he or another powerful dark wizard showed up. Even if you don't believe I keep fighting Voldemort, hiss, there's no doubt that his former minions are still out there. A couple of them kept attacking me last year. Did they ever catch the Lestranges? Isn't the Crouch guy still at large? Any one of those could make a bid to take over. Can you say that the political disagreements that let him gain followers in the first place are solved? Admittedly, part of that was rehearsed. Dumbledore figured I might have to talk to the media eventually, and had explained what he thought the wizarding public would accept. He talked me out of talking about the Wraith, and certainly about the dark magic that was keeping him from dying fully. That's certainly a lot for our readers to think about. Speaking of readers, since Sirius Black is known to be one, do you have anything to say to him? I gave it some honest thought. No matter how bad the guy had wound up being, I didn't think I'd wish 12 years in Azkaban on anyone. That he should cut his losses. Azkaban is cruel and unusual punishment. I can understand why he would do whatever he could to get out. But if he comes after me or anyone else at Hogwarts, he'll be right back in there. He should keep hiding. After all, I need to study for my newts this year. I'd rather not have to fight off another dark wizard. Such confidence, which is a great segue to my other publication. Is the rumor true that you're taken, or can our teen witch readers hold out hope? Taken, sorry. She's actually around here somewhere, and I should get back to her. I tried to use the excuse to cut the interview short, but then I saw quite possibly my least favorite person on the planet striding up. Actually, Dresden, Dawlish smiled smugly. We need to take you into protective custody. The fair-haired Aura was still trying to work the John Constantine look, tan trenchcoat, cigarette stains, and all. A couple of other Auras I'd seen around, but didn't know were flanking him, and they had wands at the ready. I guess that explained how I'd gotten separated from my group for long enough to give an interview. And they were carefully in between me and my foci, still waiting for pickup across the room. I stared, annoyed, at a point in the middle of his forehead. I didn't think he'd suddenly picked up mind-reading skills, but no reason to risk it. I hadn't met Rita Skeeter's eyes for the same reason. Yeah, I've heard Hogwarts is the safest place there is. Yet, if that's where a murderer is going to try to kill you, it would be a shame for him to find you there, the man drawled, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. Headline: Overzealous Auras try to imprison an adult wizard and keep him from completing his education, I stated, glancing over at Skeeter. She looked absolutely delighted to be included in this little play, though I pretty much thought she must have been in on it in the first place to know when to ambush me. Just come along quietly, Dresden. The press will find this is on the up and up. Dawlish gritted out, once again remembering why he hated dealing with me. He gestured with his wand, and I felt like the clear implication was that I was defenseless. Akio staff, I said. You might want to duck. I held my hand up, and my staff sailed into my hand with a thunk, having flown lengthwise over all three Auras' heads to their great surprise. I thought Skeeter looked impressed. While I'd love to keep how much I could do without a focus secret, at least part of it was certain to have gotten back to Voldemort, assuming he hadn't personally seen what happened while he was in a cauldron and I was escaping from his death trap. Are you arming yourself in front of duly appointed Auras? Dawlish tried. Just retrieving my possessions. Or am I under arrest rather than under protective custody, like you said? Akio gear. With my staff to augment the spell, I was able to summon the rest of my stuff all in one go, a bundle of belt, bracelet, and amulet all flying across to me. Is Mr. Dresden under arrest? Skeeter asked, painfully curious. The green quill hadn't stopped writing when our interview had ended and was clearly recording the entire exchange. For his own safety, he needs to be under aura protection, Dawlish tried, but it was clear he was no longer having fun. Then I better get out there and meet back up with my aura escort then, right? I said, trying for deadpan, but I probably let too much smug humor into my voice. The Longbottoms are more senior auras than you, right? War heroes. Great couple. Starting to be good friends. Not sure there's anyone else I'd be more happy to have watching my back. I did see them right outside, Skeeter offered, uninterested in clearing the smug glee from her own face. Dawlish glanced back at her betrayed. I'd have to remember that she was a fickle ally. Fine, you're free to go, Dawlish basically snarled, twirling and leading his press gang away. We should schedule a time for a longer interview, Harry, Skeeter told me, assuming I owed her. I'll let you know once I'm sure what you print from the current one is fair, I smiled back. Draco Malfoy wasn't the only one who was learning that it was useful to have a friend in the news business. Dealing with the Lovegoods was probably training wheels for this lady, but I felt like I'd picked up a few solid strategies. She didn't seem totally happy with that, but smiled magnanimously anyway. Enjoy your year at Hogwarts. I nodded, and finally hurried out of the security room, right into a pair of Dementors. Hell's bells, I yelled, well, maybe shrieked a little, and held my staff in front of me trying to juggle my other foci that I hadn't been able to put on yet. It took me a second to realize I wasn't feeling the soul-crushing despair, even though there were Dementors right next to me, and finally glanced down to see that they were contained in runic matrices around circles that had been chalked onto the floor. Guard dogs only, sir, the aura manning the checkpoint told me. Were those here before? I asked, quick-stepping through the Dementor gauntlet and into the anteroom proper. I hastily hung my amulet around my neck and held my shield bracelet in my teeth while I tried to buckle my belt back on. Special security upgrade for these times. They'd know Sirius Black no matter how he was disguised. Maybe they had accounted for some of the security holes I'd noticed. Fair enough, I said around the clasp of my bracelet before finally getting my belt set and putting the bracelet back on my left wrist. No, no word of this. Lips are sealed, so happens to a lot of people. The aura gave me a faint smile. It was nice to see that not all of them had it out for me. Probably my Order of the Phoenix friends were a big help in that. I finally exited into the British side anteroom, where we could take a portkey or apparate out, and realized there were several other exits into the room, and all of my friends were already in there waiting. Harry, Mathilda quick-stepped up. What kept you? Porter distracted me, then Dawlish tried to take me into protective custody, I said, doing the air quotes and everything, despite nearly dropping my staff to do so. All set, though. Good, good, Mrs. Weasley bustled up. You almost missed the portkey to the alley. Let's get a move on. Reporter, huh? Mathilda asked as we were putting hands on the length of rope that served as our group portkey. Yeah. Oh, she also writes for Teen Witch Weekly and may have asked about who I was dating. The witches of Britain are apparently very interested. Harry, what did you tell H? She didn't quite finish her question before the portkey triggered. Chapter 32, Hexcon 4, Bad Dog. Chapter text Alley Cats. I don't know about this whole professor thing. Junior Aura Tonks complained as I strolled with her and Percy through Diagon Alley. She'd finally been promoted out of the apprenticeship program and had to deal with the hurdle she'd missed while she was concerned with graduation. How to keep dating Remus Lupin while he was a living professor at Hogwarts. Do I just go to Hogsmeade after work, walk up to the gates, and ask to see my boyfriend? Do any of the professors have spouses? Do they even date? You could have probably used the secret passages, I told her, but I think McGonagall filled all of them in while Dumbledore was paralyzed. She'd better have, or Mad Eye will go spare, Tonks agreed. It was interesting getting to spend time with the only slightly older Aura outside of her just being over at my house, because she was my landlord's girlfriend. She was the current Aura on deck to watch my back until I went back to school, because the Longbottoms wanted to spend more time with their kids the week before school, and occasionally had to go into the office. I still wasn't entirely sure why the Weasleys and Longbottoms had decided to spend the last week of summer vacation taking rooms at the Leaky Cauldron rather than going home. It suited me because Remus, It was going to be really hard getting used to calling him Professor Lupin. Had already shut his house up and moved into his Hogwarts accommodations, so I would have had to figure something out regardless. Unfortunately, only Hermione had convinced her parents to let her stay as well, so the rest of our friends had gone home to spend a last week with their families. After a month of basically spending every waking moment with our girlfriends, as well as Oliver and Alexis, Percy and I were a little at loose ends, just rambling around the alley without anything specific to do. And while it was interesting to spend more than a couple of hours in the Victorian shopping mall that was Diagon Alley, a week was too long when you'd already blown through your summer funds and were back to being broke. We'd browsed ourselves out at the bookstore, finished all of our summer homework, done a bunch of work on our next apology spell development, and even spent time looking at the brand new Firebolt racing broom at the Quidditch store, even though neither of us cared about Quidditch. So we were on to strolling and talking, after we'd gotten bored with sitting and talking, and loitering in shops and talking. I still find it hard to understand the rationale for leaving so many tunnels off the grounds for so long, Percy complained. I could understand one or two heavily warded exits in case of siege, but to just have unmonitored exits that students can find and use, just because your brothers thought they were unmonitored doesn't mean they were, I disagreed. The longer I know Dumbledore, the more I think he really enjoys students thinking they're getting away with something. I'd bet you a lot of the time students thought they were sneaking out of the castle, he had some scheme or other they were assisting. I half expect he's already dug a couple of new tunnels over the summer that we'll be allowed to find out about when it's important. Dresden, you don't half trust the old man, do you? Tonks asked. We were still on a last-name basis. She tried to stay on a last-name basis with everyone because she didn't like people calling her by her first name. It didn't mean we weren't getting to be friends. She may have still been on a last-name basis with Remus, her boyfriend. Oh, I trust him plenty. I just think he's manipulative, I shrugged. Just because I expect he's manipulating people to try to ensure something good happens for everyone doesn't mean I have to like knowing it. He swore he was going to try to play things a little bit more straight with me this year, but we'll see. I mean, what in the world is that? I've been distracted by the rising third years exiting the pet store. Neville, Ron, and Seamus, who'd managed to show up for the shopping day, looked slightly nonplussed as Hermione happily cooed at an orange pile of fur half as big as she was. I thought she was going to get a post owl so her parents could write her at school and she could write her friends over the summer, Percy asked. He'd always been proud of his own owl, even though most of his friends could just flew over to hang out during the summer, and he had no use for Hermes at Hogwarts except to write home, which he could have used a school owl to do. As we got closer, I was able to tell that the new pet was an enormous cat, awkwardly held by the young witch. The thing must have been at least half Kneazle, a breed of mystical cat, and was basically twice as big as any house cat I'd ever seen. It regarded me from a smushed face that looked like it had survived dashing into a wall at high speed. Hermione, who is that? I said, stopping to regard the immense ginger beast. And do you think he'll let me rub that giant floofy belly? Isn't he gorgeous? She beamed. His name is Crookshanks. The lady said for some reason he'd been there a long time and nobody before me wanted him. Can you believe it? I can believe it, Ron muttered, rubbing his head. He fell on me. Given that the boy basically had a hollow leg with as fast as he was growing, I'd bet he had all kinds of snacks secreted about his person that the cat would go after. I ignored him and focused on the cat. He climbed up onto Hermione's shoulders to get a better look at me. Despite my question, I knew better than to immediately go for a belly rub. With the claws on the big guy, I'd need a tourniquet. Instead, I held my finger out for him to sniff. After a moment of pretend haughtiness, he inclined his head to me to scratch. He could probably tell immediately that I was a sucker that it was good to be friends with. He was probably right. Oi, Seamus suddenly said. Please tell me I'm not T.H. only one seeing that. It's a bleedin' grim, like right out of T.H. Divination book. We all turned, and confirming it wasn't just Seamus, the cat jumped down in front of Hermione and raised his hackles hissing. Across the street, lurking by the steps into a home goods store, was an immense black hound that looked diseased and deranged. It eyed our group hungrily, took a step forward, and then apparently reconsidered taking on 3 grown wizards, 4 kids, and an immense cat. It turned and rushed off into Knockturn Alley, Crookshanks spitting and chasing it a few feet before deciding the dog had been successfully intimidated and walking proudly back to the group. Such a brave boy. Hermione gushed at her new familiar. It's a bleeding grim. It's an omen of death. Seamus kept muttering. As far as I knew, he and Ron were the only two of the four who decided to stick with taking divination class, Seamus adding ancient runes, at my insistence. Ron was also taking care of magical creatures and muggle studies. Neville both of those plus runes, and Hermione was the only one taking arithmancy instead of creatures class. I think it was just an alley dog, Tonks corrected, though she seemed to be papering over a bit of concern at how big it had been. Were its eyes glowing red? Ron asked. Probably just reflecting the light, Tonks shrugged. I hadn't really noticed that, because it was in the sun enough that even if they had been glowing it would have been hard to make out. I was suddenly struck by a thought and asked, so, Dementors sense your mind, right? And in Transfiguration last year, McGonagall mentioned that an animagus in their animal form is much more like the animal, mentally, than a normal human transfiguration, which might mean a Dementor could have a harder time seeing or affecting an animagus. That sounds like a very reasonable supposition, Percy allowed. Why? I talked slowly, working it out as I spoke. I really wish I'd have figured this out earlier, and Remus never actually wants to talk about it for sure, but... What do you think the chances are that Canny's major, the kid from his books who turns into a black dog, is literally because his friend, Sirius Black, was an animagus that turns into a black dog? Seems kind of on the nose, right? Tonks groaned, her pink hair flickering hues before settling on an embarrassed red. I still wasn't totally sure what was up with that, though I had heard of wizards born with a natural metamorph ability, so that's what I figured. I am going to kill that dear, stupid man for keeping a secret this big. Damn, I've got to call this in. Expecto Nuntius, tell Scrimgeour, potential black sighting fleeing into Knockturn Alley, maybe a black dog animagus. Her silvery jackrabbit patroness dashed off toward the ministry with the message. We should find the rest of the families. Percy nodded, prefect reflexes kicking in. We can get somewhere safe so you can join in the hunt. Thanks, Tonks sighed, her hair fading to a muted auburn. This is going to be a long afternoon. Need me to stick around to explain it? I asked her. She shook her head, saying, No. I've read all the books now and could have figured it out too. I should have dug more into what Lupin knew about my cousin after the escape, but we didn't have much time together this month with the search and his classes. More quietly, just to me, she added, and it's almost his time of month now, so he's going to be prickly about it. You might actually get him to fess up before I can. Just keep your head on a swivel. At least Black's form is big, so it makes it hard for him to sneak into places. I nodded. Just think if the traitor in that friend's group had been the one who could turn into a rat. Strangers on a train, it had to be the school trunks. It's all I could think of. Nobody trusted kids to hang onto a box as big as them going through the flu, and hardly anyone felt confident sidelong apparating a little kid in their trunk. It was the only explanation for the inefficiencies, unless flu outages like what had happened when Maeve forced her way into our reality were more common than I thought. It was all I could think of for why we'd been packed into enchanted ministry sedans to whip through traffic to get to the train station, starting less than a mile away. To get on a train for 8 hours to get to Hogsmeade, when I could have been there in less than a minute by just stepping into the inn's flue. I had to admit, the crazy space-bending cars were pretty fun to ride in. We navigated through traffic by folding space to let the cars simply squeeze through gaps between other vehicles. The enchanting to get them to do that at all, much less not be immediately obvious, had to be immense. Of course, we were on Weasley time, so even with the special cars we got to the train much later than my usual. Fortunately, the rest of the crew had already staked out essentially every cabin on one of the train cars. Given that I didn't really have a home address to come back to this year, I'd probably be spending both holidays based out of the castle, so this might be my last train ride to school. It was weird to be getting nostalgic about my last year at a school I'd originally basically been forced to go to. The seniors' compartment was made plausible only because half of us were prefects, so it wasn't 6 people full the whole time. As the train set out, Percy, Penny, and Alexis were all in the prefect meeting in the front car, So it was just Oliver, Mathilda, and me, busily sharing our last week, as if it had been a million years since we'd last seen each other. So we're basically working under the assumption that Sirius Black is an animagus that can turn into a giant, mangy-looking black dog, I finished. Like that one? Mathilda asked, her position closer to the door meaning she was looking out the train's window while also facing me. I looked up just in time to see the black dog perched like a gargoyle on one of the last road overpasses over the train tracks before we left London, probably barely 20 feet above the top of the train. I couldn't be completely sure, but it looked a lot like the one we'd seen, and it was almost certainly unusual for any dog to get up on the wall around a road to stare intently at passing trains. Stars and stones, exactly like that one. Pivoting to try to get a look, the train was going around a curve, and I couldn't have seen anything behind us, even if the width of the overpass weren't in the way. But we were close to the front, so there was plenty of space behind us if the dog wanted to drop down and stow away. Long-distance apparition was still not completely fixed after Maeve cracked the veil months earlier, and he might have problems stealing someone's flu. So maybe this was the most efficient way for him to get to the school. Or maybe he planned to go after his target while there was a severe limit of adults, wards, and dementors to stop him. I need to go inform the prefects, I told them. Keep an eye on the kids. At least we got our cabins all close together, so everyone in the photo was on the same train car rather than spread out. Draco was the only member of the trip who wasn't nearby, but he'd also skipped the photo so as to avoid being associated with the Weasleys, and thus was unlikely to be the target. It was still probably worth warning him. The first car was a more traditional open arrangement, with an aisle down the middle and no individual compartments, though it looked like the front was closed off into storage for the snack trolley. It probably would have been impossible for the 24 prefects to meet if they had to deal with individual four-person cabins. I knocked my staff politely against the door between cars before stepping in, clearly interrupting Jake Flinton in the middle of some long-winded planning speech for the year. While I liked the guy well enough the little I'd interacted with him in classes, I suspected the head boy and girl positions were basically designed to make petty tyrants of teenagers who had never before really engaged in any form of student government. Sorry to interrupt, I said before he could yell at me for doing so. And not to panic anyone, but there's a decent chance Sirius Black just jumped off an overpass to stow away on the train. I saw a bunch of faces ready to enact their power over adolescents suddenly filled with fear at having to take on a crazed escaped convict. Well, Percy, Penny, and Alexis just looked annoyed at the interruption, as if this kind of thing was par for the course for them these days. My fault, I was sure. Oh, also Maeve didn't seem bothered. I hadn't even realized she'd finagled her way into a prefect position. I wondered what she'd done to the poor girl that originally held it for her year. I tried to completely ignore the white dreadlocked she-princess. He may be an animagus that turns into a big black dog, I explained to those that hadn't gotten the memo. Unless anyone objects, I'm going to inform the auras, I continued. But you might want to go ahead and start patrols. But we don't have a way to inform the auras. One of the new fifth-year prefects exclaimed, on the verge of panic. I thought she was from Ravenclaw, maybe. I didn't know her name. Oh man, if I was going to help Remus with his classes, I'd probably actually have to learn the names of a bunch of the students. Being a grown-up was rough. Nobody actually objected, though few seemed to know what I had in mind, so I just grinned pleasantly and incanted, expecto nuntius. And as the messenger version of Mouse appeared, an oversized lion-like dog made of silvery light, I told him, "Tell Tonks." Black dog spotted on a bridge overpass as the train went underneath. May have jumped aboard. The instruction delivered. He ran off through the walls of the train, back in the general direction of London. I still hadn't confirmed whether that was super cheatery and would let me triangulate to track people that I didn't have a sympathetic link for. It was at least risky, because anyone I wanted to track down might start running when they started getting repeated messages from my patroness. Fortunately, I was pretty sure pure muggles couldn't see a patroness any more than they could see a dementor, so I at least wouldn't be breaking the statute of secrecy doing it in muggle areas. One of you want to inform the headmaster? I asked. That spell took a lot out of me, and I had to maintain it until it reached its target. I didn't want to admit in front of Maeve that throwing out a second one would leave me unable to do much else for a while. In fact, Ms. Malfoy. Heard you're a dab hand at charms. Want to show off? I actually wasn't totally sure whether the Lady of the Winter Fae could actually cast spells like a wizard. I suspected she'd been faking everything with the closest equivalent glamour and ice magic that she could create. And I'd eat my hat, if I had one, if she had enough of a soul to cast a patroness, regardless. I don't actually know the headmaster very well, she shrugged dismissively. Doubt I could get a fix on him. He doesn't really make time for Slytherins like he does for Gryffindors. I'm sure one of you is more than capable, though. Alexis just shook her head at the elf once more, wriggling out of a social confrontation, and quickly had her silver fox bounding off north with a similar message for Dumbledore. Right, let's get patrolling. Flinton took control of the meeting back. Don't get separated, just in case. Everyone stay on shift for a half hour past your original cut-off time, so we have plenty of coverage. Call for help if you see him. Don't be a hero. He gave all the Gryffindors a very Hufflepuff look at that statement. As they all headed out, I ignored Maeve and told the head girl, Gemma Farley, I don't think Draco is a likely target, but you should probably warn him just in case. I'd had a fair number of classes with Gemma over the last couple of years, and she was one of the only Slytherins in my year that I thought were good people. She nodded, but told me, get back to your compartment, please, Dresden. Let us handle the patrols. I'm sure you'll come charging in if there's screaming. It was mostly good-natured, so I grinned and let it slide, following her instructions and heading back. Patrols were by house rather than relationship status, so Penny was off the first patrol shift while Percy and Alexis wandered the train, and we caught her up on what had been going on. By the time she had to start her own patrol, we were a ways into the countryside, and half an hour later, our house prefects finally finished and headed in. It was starting to look like miserable weather outside. Nothing that we can find so far, Percy explained, sinking into a seat. Alexis leaned against Oliver, visibly annoyed. I said the best flyers should borrow racing brooms and fly around to check the roof and undercarriage, but Jake wouldn't go for it. You should have taken the head position, Percy. I probably would have said the same thing, to be fair, Percy admitted. If Black has obtained a wand, he could shoot you out of the air. On a moving train with limited backup, I could not justify the risk. At least if we encounter him in the train, we have cover. We tried to keep the conversation light until Penny finally got back from her patrol, the room getting especially cramped as three couples tried to sit together in a space designed for 4 adult-sized people. Some kids in the third car from the end thought they might have heard something land on the roof at about the right time, Penny explained. But they're second years, and the rumors have already gone all up and down the train, so they were freaked out and may have just been imagining it. By now, even though it was still early afternoon, it was nearly fully dark outside from the storm clouds. Every time the train went around a curve, I peered out, trying to get a glimpse of a darker shadow clinging to the roof. Maybe I just wanted to use a Shatner voice. There's something on the wing. Quote. But if he was on the express, he had found somewhere less obvious to hide than clinging to the top of the train for 8 hours. We eventually solved the space issue by Oliver and Mathilda taking the seats on one side of the room, Percy and Penny taking the other, and Alexis and I sitting on the floor below our significant others, so the research team could talk spells while Oliver and Mathilda played cards quietly. Over the summer, we decided to invite Alexis to help with spell development. Spending so much time with her, we realized it was weird we hadn't included her before. She'd already had a couple of ideas about places in the arithmancy we'd been stuck. Around 5, though it was dark enough outside to seem like midnight under the driving rain, it was time for Percy and Alexis to go back on patrol. Penny excused herself to go spend some time checking up on the Ravenclaw Lowriers, and Oliver went next door to have a Quidditch team meeting. Alone at last. Mathilda grinned, leaning against me as I reclaimed my seat after a couple of hours on the floor. We'd been making out for less than a minute before the door to our compartment banged open and Hermione and Draco trooped in, followed by Crookshanks. Ah, it's like their faces are some kind of magical magnets or something, the boy drawled. They can't help it, they're full of hormones. Hermione defended, and insulted us at the same time. You will be soon, too. I'm sure Pansy's just waiting for your face to have a magnet. Though he was good at controlling his reactions, the slight blush was very visible on Draco's pale skin. Are we studying or what? Are you studying? I asked. And if so, why here? Quidditch, Hermione answered. Slytherin, Draco answered, gesturing to indicate that Hermione probably wouldn't be especially welcome in his part of the train. They both got out numerology and grammatica books, taking the seats opposite ours in the compartment. I thought you were taking magical creatures class instead of arithmancy, I asked Draco. I got advanced word who was teaching it and changed my elective. I'd rather learn about creatures through independent study, Draco shrugged. He saw the 3 Gryffindors had no clue, so explained. Your gigantic friend Hagrid, he didn't tell you lot. Good for Hagrid, Mathilda cheered. I knew he was trying to keep a big secret. Must have been the longest he's ever managed to keep a secret, Hermione mused, absently, trying to find the page she wanted in her book. Do we think he's going to start on a reasonable curriculum, or have the third years on class XXX creatures from day one, because he thinks anything less dangerous than that isn't worth anyone's time? I wondered. Mathilda's eyes got wide and she said, I'll talk to him, first thing. Anyway, I started having trouble on Chapter 8, you. Hermione asked Draco. The two overachievers helped each other with arithmancy for a while, with a little input from me when they got stuck. There were hardly any arithmancy students from Slytherin in my year, so it wasn't a surprise that Draco was having a hard time finding kids in his own house to study with. I was proud of him that he'd gotten to the point that he was willing to treat Hermione as a valid study partner, even though he was still pretty chilly to her in their non-academic interactions. It was a shame that she hadn't been able to make it for the whole Egypt trip. He got almost chummy with Neville, Luna, and Ginny, and could get along with Ron for several minutes at a time, which was real progress. Mathilda had gotten bored and nodded off to sleep snuggled against me after a while, and I couldn't help but notice that Draco's sideways glances weren't really disgust at the PDA, but curiosity. He was probably feeling the hormones more than he wanted Hermione to know. Crookshanks had decided the two of us were acceptably respectful humans who made a nice warm spot and sprawled across our laps. It was past time for Percy and Alexis to show back up, but maybe they'd found their own so's elsewhere on the train. I was quietly answering a question the kids had about into total numerological values by word, and when by syllable when the train's brakes suddenly went on, and the deceleration caused us to jolt, and the luggage racks to sway dangerously. We there already? Mathilda asked, sitting up, upsetting the cat who gave a bit of a grumbling hiss before flopping to the ground and rejoining Hermione on the other seats. Not unless someone really kicked up the throttle, I said, glancing at Hermione for confirmation. She checked her wristwatch and nodded. We should still be at least an hour out. A few moments after the train fully shuddered to a stop, with the sound of poorly secured luggage falling in the other compartments, pounding rain still hammering against the roof and windows, all the lanterns went out at once. I don't like that, I said. I slid my arm out from behind Mathilda and stood up, retrieving my staff from the luggage rack. I think something's moving out there, maybe coming aboard, Draco said, peering into the darkness. Personally, I didn't think anyone's eyes could adjust that fast, particularly with how pitch black it was outside. I could hear the kids in the other compartments bumping into each other in the dark, and a wince of pain as Hermione bumped Draco, also trying to look out the window. Lumos, I said, lighting up my mother's amulet where it hung around my neck. Why's it so cold all of a sudden? Hermione asked. I didn't feel cold exactly, but more like the memory of being cold, stuck in a cell in Azkaban, starting to remember the death of Justin and Dementors, I said, realizing. I quickly stuck my head into the corridor and yelled, Dementors searching for Black. Stay in your compartments. I saw a tall, black-cloaked figure coming in from the next car. It wasn't so much illuminated by my amulet light as it was a perfect black silhouette against the end of the corridor where my light could reach. I yanked my head back in and slammed the door, leaning my staff against the wall and reaching into my belt to retrieve my unicorn horn focus. I don't like this, Draco muttered. Why are they here? If he was inside the train, we'd have found him. I felt Mathilda grasping for my hand, as if to reassure herself that I was there and she wasn't alone. I hate them, but we have to let them search, I quietly told everyone. But then the blackness eclipsed the window into our compartment and stopped. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it remembered me from my brief stay at the prison and wanted another taste. I was starting to fall down a well, and only my girlfriend's hand in mine was keeping me present. "He's not in here," I yelled at the creature. "Draco," Hermione choked out. I glanced and the boy had slumped, seemingly unconscious, into his seat. Probably too quietly for even Hermione to make out. I could barely hear him whimper, "Aunt Bella, please. I don't want to learn to resist the Cruciatus. Please, no." And the compartment door began to creak slowly open, corpse-like fingers translucent in the spell light reaching in to drag it open as Crookshanks puffed up and hissed. I was back in the prison. Everyone around me died, and it was my fault. I'd be alone forever. The looming spectre assured me implicitly that I'd watch everyone around me die, and then I'd die alone. Sirius Black isn't in here. I choked out, barely defiant, clutching desperately at Elaine's, no, Mathilda's fingers in mine. Draco continued to whimper in his trance. Hermione was clutching Crookshanks for protection and comfort. Mathilda whispered something about wolves. It would be so easy to let the cold claim me, just give up, and let the monsters win. But the fingers twined in mine were far more real than anything the undead abomination forced into my mind. I hadn't made all these friends just to let them die, and I hadn't spent 2 years studying soulfire to forget it in the moment I'd learned it for. And no creepy undead, letharfold too stupid and vicious to even do its one job was going to stop me. Expecto Patronum. Fax machine. The train started moving again shortly after Mouse chased the Dementor off. I heard later that my friends had marshaled their own patronesses to clear the other parts of the train where the Dementors were being overly thorough, though nothing like what happened to us. I was half certain that I'd find out Dawlish, or one of his cronies, had been running the operation, and had deliberately let the creatures on the train instead of just searching around it, probably with advice that they should check my compartment in particular. Fortunately, there didn't seem to be any permanent harm other than everyone's chocolate stores being raided, such that the first Hogsmeade weekend was going to see a furious restocking at Honeyduke's. Why did eating chocolate ameliorate the effects of Dementor exposure? I was sure Penny would have at least a praesis on the subject if we asked her to work it out. The rain let up a bit by the time we stopped for real in Hogsmeade, enough to dash to the carriages, only somewhat damp. I was sad to realize that, after the bombing in Cairo, most of my friends could now clearly see the Thestrals that pulled the conveyances up to the school. The previous year, few of them had ever truly seen someone die up close. Penny, particularly, seemed about to cry again when she realized what that meant. Though the last couple of years probably should have dented the faith in the safety of Hogwarts, spirits slowly rose in the warm Great Hall as the new first years were sorted and the food got closer to arriving. I was all set for Dumbledore to give his customary statement that he'd make his remarks after the feast, but this year he actually had something to say beforehand. "While I don't wish to delay the feast," he began, "this knowledge may sit heavier on a full stomach. As you are aware from their entry on the train, the prison guards of Azkaban are on full alert for the escaped convict Sirius Black. We would have all preferred they not trouble you, but their presence did turn out to be necessary. Marks were found on the roof of the express that indicate a large animal leapt down upon the train to stow away as it left London. While nothing was found, it is very likely the creature in question was scared away by the arrival of the search party, and they are currently combing the countryside near where the train was stopped. I say creature out of caution, for we are not yet certain if it is the same person, but I saw him shoot a glance to Remus down the table. We have learned that Sirius Black is an unregistered animagus that takes the form of a large black dog. If you see such a beast, or the man himself, you should immediately retreat and seek out a professor or other authority figure. To help prevent this, the Dementors will be stationed outside the grounds of the school, while they have been ordered not to harm students. As you may have seen on the train, their nature can fight against their directives. While sneaking off the grounds or into the forest is always forbidden, this year you may find the consequences much more dire than others. The Dementors will not be fooled by stealth, nor guile, nor even magical invisibility. Our prefects and the head boy and girl have been entreated to be especially diligent while we play host to these creatures, and I implore all of you to listen to their directives for your own safety. And on a happier note, Hogwarts has a new professor for care of magical creatures, now that Professor Kettleburn has retired to spend more time with his remaining limbs, and I would like everyone to please welcome his replacement, our very own Rubeus Hagrid. The magnitude of the applause was much stronger from Gryffindor than anywhere else. I resolved to remind Mathilda to talk to Hagrid soonest. I would also like to note that our temporary defense against the dark arts professor, who taught a very informative spring term, has graciously taken the position full-time. We all have high hopes that Professor Lupin will finally bring some stability to a position that's experienced too much turnover of late. And I think that's everything worth mentioning. Tuck in. McGonagall flagged me down to walk with her as everyone was leaving the dining hall. The severe yet grandmotherly Scottish witch told me, "Hoss, we didn't want to call you out in case students would be upset about the Dementors, and because you don't seem to care about points, but good job identifying Black. You may well have stopped him from hitching a ride all the way to Hogsmeade. 20 points to Gryffindor." Thilda spotted him. I shrugged, but nodded that I appreciated being appreciated. How was your summer? I dare say not as exciting as yours. Vampires and red caps, I hear. I just got a bit of relaxation between breaking in 2 new professors. Werewolves and giants, I told her quietly. It's all in how you spin it. The battle to get them to turn in a proper lesson plan was epic at that, she said. I even got a bit of a smile out of the stoic old lady. Yeah, we'd bonded. There and then, I made it my goal for the year to actually get a genuine chortle out of her. Speaking of which, she continued, thanks for your help with Remus' lesson plan. He's still feeling a bit poorly after yesterday and it's late, but let's find a time to meet about your assistance with his classes this weekend. I nodded my agreement, and she headed off to her rooms while I jogged to catch up to Gryffindor before I missed the new password. I still thought there was probably a more secure system for accessing the rooms, especially with a killer after one or more of us. It was another year where September 1st wasn't on a weekend, so the first week was just Thursday and Friday. The next morning, I got to actually take it easy because I had a free period, but the rest of the day was one of my busier ones. Arithmancy, runes, double transfiguration for my official classes, and my focus group seminar in my free period right after lunch. I wasn't totally sure when Wild Bill was doing his seminars for the younger kids. I'd heard he'd gotten a day job that wasn't in Hogsmeade for the year, but was fluing in for his classes. At least, unlike my 6th year, we didn't have to juggle Millicent Bulstrode's classes to find an overlapping free period. The Slytherin girl had grown another couple of inches over the summer, but her growth rate finally seemed to be slowing down. She probably wouldn't actually reach 6 feet, but was destined to be burly regardless. If her house's Quidditch team wasn't so devoted to chauvinism, they'd have put her on as a beater or keeper immediately. I probably hadn't helped much by pulling her out of flying class for the focus seminar during her first year. "How was your summer, Millie?" Hermione asked, as the bigger girl, also a cat lover, cooed over Crookshanks. She shrugged. We were supposed to go on vacation in Finnegan's neck of the woods, but my mum thought it was too dangerous, and we just went to the shore for a bit. Seamus nodded. Tea wasn't too bad o'er the summer, but tea's been tense, sure enough. The troubles, Mida says. Wizards aren't Catholic or Protestant, so both sides might be after us if and they knew. I had to shake memories of Penny crying over her injured father the year before, and a horrified rage as she struggled to save who she could in the bombing during the summer. Even wizards couldn't live entirely separate from the rest of the world. And if the Death Eaters had their way, we'd be back to having our own equivalent organization of terrorists, soon enough much more close to home. And I still wasn't sure what to make of the she-red cap, suggesting that the Fae were exacerbating all these violent disagreements for their own ends. "Why don't we do some runes review? All of you have your first class tomorrow, right?" I said to interrupt my own dark mood. Turned out they did. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday were elective days for the third years, and Friday involved a fair amount of juggling because they also had several core classes. Hermione was probably already happy she wasn't having to time travel to make classes. My Friday was similarly packed, of course. Double arithmancy, defense, double charms, and runes. I missed my owl year when I somehow got Fridays totally free. Professor Lupin, was mostly recovered from his monthlies by the pre-lunch defense class and laid out the plan for the year, which, like most of my other classes, was about drilling down on specifics where we were still weak on the Newt standards. A couple more people hadn't hacked it through sixth-year defense, even with Lockhart teaching, and nobody in the small class was interested in objecting to me being the tar, especially after I admitted I'd probably basically written our lessons from the previous year, even if, because of the memory-charming bastard, I couldn't remember any of it. But on the whole, despite the heavy loads in my final year, I felt pretty good about it. It's not like I actually cared what I got on my newts, because there was basically no chance of me working anywhere that wanted them. So I got to use the year to learn all the fun high-end magic that I wanted. It didn't seem like Hermione was as sanguine. I noticed her fuming at a study table after dinner with Ron, Neville, and her roommates Parvati and Lavender. I read through the textbook and knew this was lacking, but I wasn't prepared for just how uninformed Professor Burbage would be. She's a lovely woman, and I'm sure she's an excellent educator, but I don't think she understands everything she doesn't know. I don't know. Ron tried to curb the young witch's temper. A lot of stuff she talked about are things my dad's tried to explain to me before. I think we even have a fax machine in the shed. We just don't have the electricity. It was clear when he stumbled that he realized that was wrong, to make them download facts. Or what did she talk about? The telephone lines. It's a teleophone, Ronald, Lavender disagreed. Didn't you all get to use one of the teleovision devices over winter halls at Professor Lupin's house? I must not have sufficiently contained my guffaw because Hermione turned and said, Harry, tell them. Giving her my best, I told you so look. I ambled over to the table and explained, this is the point where Hogwarts not having a Latin class is really hurting you coming and going. A lot of Muggle terms, especially for technology, use the same root words as spells. Telephones and television both use the same root as teleport, hearing or seeing across a distance. Fax with an X is short for, I think, facsimile, or to make something similar, because it creates a copy of the document you feed in at one end and prints it out on the other. Electricity, that one I'm stumped on. I don't know why it's called that. I looked it up, Hermione said. It's the word for amber because you'd rub amber on wool to get static electricity. I nodded. I vaguely remembered that Latin word. So basically, if you crack down on learning your Latin, you'll have a really good clue about what Muggle technology does based on the roots, and you'll have an easier time understanding what new spells do. I looked down at the fuming, bushy-haired genius and said, and Hermione, if Burbage is so far off from right, that just means this is another target-rich environment. The more stuff you have in your suggestions for improving the class, the more they're likely to implement. That seemed to mollify her, and Parvati beamed, and I think we're going to do great in this class. After all, we have our own personal human facts machines. Lavender just shook her head and frowned. Parv, we've talked about this. You have to stop punning. It makes you seem silly. Chapter 33, Hexcon 5, Riding Lesson. Chapter text riding lesson. A barrage of conjured missiles rattled off of the side of the dumpster as I dove behind it, just narrowly missing me. I'd finally got a little better at taking falls, and managed to roll on the pavement and bleed off some energy rather than taking it all on my knee. I even managed to pop back up at the end, leveling my blasting rod and using a screamed reducto to blow up the trash cans my assailants were using as cover. With the momentary distraction, I was able to cross from my own cover to the corner of the brick building nearby. Taking the antique fire escape up was risky, because I was exposed if they could get down the alley and around the corner while I was still climbing, but I was chancing that I was faster than they were. Of course, I hadn't counted on the sound of shoes clanking on iron steps giving away my plan. While they couldn't make the sprint in time to catch me, my attackers were more than capable of hampering me from where they were. One chanted out, Avies. and sent a conjured storm of birds pelting around the corner after me, while one quickly transfigured a pile of trash visible at my end of the alley into an aggressive-looking baboon that began chasing me up the fire escape. Monkeys are fast. By the time I'd managed to get a lucky shot clubbing the baboon with my blasting rod, I'd only gotten a few more steps up the escape, and two pairs of footsteps rounded the corner. "We've got you," the leader said, matter-of-factly, wand bearing down on me while his partner covered me from behind the dumpster I'd abandoned. "Fair enough," I grinned. "I didn't expect the monkey." "Nobody expects the monkey," McGonagall deadpanned from behind the dumpster. "This room is amazing," Remus said, holstering his wand and taking in the cityscape we'd had the Room of Requirement conjure. "I can't believe we never found it. We thought we'd found everything in the castle. You didn't get the Chamber of Secrets either," I told him, clanging back down the fire escape. "Who knows what else nobody knows about? Took a muggle-born asking the house elves to find this one. You're at least certain we've accounted for all the passages Black knows about?" McGonagall asked him. "Unless he kept some of them secret from us. I wouldn't have thought he would, but well, he did a lot of things I never expected." Remus frowned. "I'm far more worried about an approach through the forest, though. We were quite familiar with navigating it in animal form. I still can't believe how reckless you were, going into the forest rather than staying safe in the shack." The assistant headmistress chided him as if he were still a student. "You're the head of Gryffindor," I told her. "Fine. I can believe it, I just don't appreciate it. Remus was always the responsible one. It was a relative value, I'm afraid. Lily was the only one that could stand up to James and Sirius when they really wanted to do something stupid." He got a wistful look on his face, remembering his fellow prefect. Remus didn't talk much about his three fellow troublemakers beyond what he'd written in his books, but he almost never talked about Lily Potter, the muggle-born who'd been the Penny or Hermione of her day. What little I'd put together made me think that she was the biggest loss to the world when Voldemort wiped out the Potters, a gifted witch whose life ended far too early. Yes. Well, without the passages, we'll just have to hope the denizens of the forest are a deterrent, McGonagall stated, seemingly fighting back her own wistfulness about the departed prodigy. "The centaurs have been informed, though it's unclear how helpful they plan to be, especially with the intrusion of the Dementors. I believe Lucius Malfoy's bid to curtail the acromantulas will start over the winter at the earliest, so they may also be a difficulty for Black. I fear they've multiplied extensively since you four wandered the forest, and he certainly doesn't know about this room or the chamber," Remus nodded, "which may allow us some leeway with deployment, though I'm not yet sure how. We can't count on the chamber," I warned them. "If he was Voldemort's secret second-in-command like they say, he might have been informed at some point. I suspect at the very least those rumors are exaggerated to make Minister Fudge feel better," Remus disagreed. "While I clearly didn't keep a good enough watch on him, I'd probably have noticed if he were deeper in the Death Eaters than as a spy, and he was far too young and irresponsible, despite his Black pedigree. If anyone was Voldemort's second from our generation, it would probably have been Lucius or Bellatrix. I hope they didn't see my wince. But your point is well taken. In the meantime, though, this room has too much potential to be held in reserve. I'd like to start using it in my upper-level classes immediately. Colin's already told the secret to everyone in Gryffindor anyway," I shrugged. "You wouldn't be able to keep kids out of it, so it's probably best to schedule it officially. This place is already way more popular than the broom closets among the upper years." The things Oliver alone had let slip involving fulfilling some of his fantasies that required the top box at the Quidditch World Cup. McGonagall looked like a vein was about to pop in her forehead as she contemplated the possibilities for teen sexcapades this room represented. "We shan't be having any more of that, at least," she finally grit out. While she was super cool for an old lady in a lot of ways, she was still the daughter of a minister and grew up in the 40s and 50s. She had views on what was proper behavior for her students, and then her gaze got contemplative as she stared at me. I quickly waved my hands in denial. "Not me. Mathilda can still visit with the unicorns." I mean, she'd started making some statements like she wasn't sure she wanted to have that particular superpower for much longer, and she'd be a legal adult in the spring. "See that this status continues," my head of house ordered, in the tone of voice that meant she knew she was trying to hold back the tide with pure force of will. Speaking of Mathilda, are we done? I asked the professors. I promised to go help her help Hagrid with his lesson plan for the year, too. She barely caught him before he showed the third year's hippogriffs their first day, and now he's frantic to figure out what's actually appropriate. I heard McGonagall muttering, "He's good with the kids. He deserves a chance. He does know a lot about the subject. I just have to let him succeed without micromanaging." Massaging her forehead, she said louder, "Yes, Hoss, I think we're done." Remus. "Yeah, I think we've done all the planning we can," he acknowledged. "I'm going to stick around for a bit and try out some other configurations. The possibilities for showing how to escape from various ambushes are mind-blowing. And if we can get those animated targeting dummies that we talked about." I grinned and left them, Remus still imagining using the room as his own personal educational holodeck. The room of requirement was also extremely convenient to Gryffindor Tower, so it was no effort at all to pop over, collect my girlfriend, and head down to meet Hagrid. "How'd it go?" she asked as we walked. "McGonagall got me with a monkey," I complained. Mathilda grinned and sagely said, "Guerrilla warfare." She'd been on a kick researching apes and monkeys after her escapades defending the school with hit and run tactics the previous year, and I hadn't had the heart to explain to her what a guerrilla actually was. I'd caught her up on my morning by the time we reached Hagrid's hut down on the grounds, on what was a pretty decent Saturday to be outside talking about magical creatures. After pleasantries, involving sharing Hagrid's tea but passing on his cooking, we got on to the meat of the subject, and I suggested, maybe a good rule of thumb is nothing past Class X creatures for the third years, double X for the fourth years, and so on. Save the acromantulas and manticores for the seventh years. But the single X critters are so boring. The half-giant complained, somehow looking like a half-ton toddler despite the immense black beard. "No way I kin do a whole year on flobberworms in Horklumps. Why don't we see what you have to show off?" Mathilda offered. "Thar's right. You two kin meet the hippogriffs. You'll see how docile they are." Without further preamble, Hagrid grabbed up a brace of dead ferrets he had hanging like gruesome rustic curtains on a rope above his window and led the way out of his house. "You stay, Fang." "Poor guy," I said, as the enormous black boarhound whined and laid back down in the corner. "Worried someone will mistake him for Black." Hagrid nodded, slinging the ferrets over one shoulder and grabbing his crossbow as we headed into the forest. I suspected those boys had some extra trick to 'em. I even remember wondering whose black dog it was I'd see sneaking about after curfew. They were a right suspicious stag, too. That would probably have been James Potter, I confirmed, based on the books. And Peter Pettigrew was a rat, which would have been easier to miss. "I want to turn into an animal," Mathilda suddenly insisted. "I can probably do that for my Newt Transfiguration project. Harry, let's become animagi together." I shook my head but grinned at her enthusiasm. McGonagall already told me I don't have the mental focus to do it, even if I had the time. Not everyone does. But can you imagine if I wound up being a horse animagus? She'd just laugh and laugh. "You should definitely try it, though." "Speaking o' horses," Hagrid said, gesturing at the paddock he'd led us to, where several hippogriffs lounged around. "Come on, Beaky," he yelled, waving the brace of ferrets to get their attention. "Buckbeak's my favorite. Do they really stay inside the fence?" I asked, skeptical that something I could step over would keep in horses with wings. "Oh, aye, big herd instinct. As long as they consider this their territory, they'll only leave if they need to hunt. Fence keeps the other critters from bothering 'em." Hagrid really was a good source of information about these things, and could become a good teacher if he could properly calibrate the danger level to people that weren't 9 feet tall and all but impervious to harm. The large, eagle-headed horse that came to the name, Beaky, eyed me warily, but clearly wanted the ferrets. "Hi, Buckbeak, remember me?" Mathilda asked, walking a little away from me and bowing at the waist. The beast cocked his head at her, and then gave a little bow of his own to her after a moment. "Harry, bow so he knows you're a friend." Feeling completely ridiculous, but figuring it wasn't that different than the things you had to do to befriend a cat, I shrugged and leaned over the fence. At my height, when I bow, it's hard to miss. The hippogriff was clearly impressed, regarding me for a full 10 seconds before finally offering a bow of his own. Introduced to everyone, he ambled the rest of the way over and accepted a tossed ferret from Hagrid, catching and bolting it down in one smooth motion. Mathilda swung herself over the fence and, with clearly practiced body language, approached carefully and began to pet Buckbeak's face to his obvious pleasure. "Such a handsome boy you are," she cooed, and he actually preened. Maybe these things were a lot like cats. "See, perfectly safe," Hagrid announced. "What happens if someone isn't properly respectful? If you miss the bow and just walk right up. Hell, what if you insult one?" I asked him. "None of the kids do that," he insisted. "No Slytherins taking the class?" I asked, knowing the answer. For everyone who wasn't smart enough for arithmancy and runes and was too prejudiced for Muggle studies, the combo of divination and care of magical creatures was their only option. The school probably needed a sixth elective, maybe something boring like home economics. Would be especially funny if a bunch of pureblood heirs took it thinking they were getting a business management class and wound up having to learn to cook and sew. "Fair point," the big man nodded, finally getting it. "Maybe I kin do hippogriffs later, once I've made sure the kids know they kin get hurt if they don't respect the creatures." "Sounds like a good plan," I told him, and he beamed. "You've got this, man. You just have to remember that some of the kids are jerks, and none of them are as tough as you." Hagrid, Mathilda asked. "How much can they fly with? Buckbeak can do a few £100, right?" "Oh, aye," he nodded. "Obviously he couldn't lift me, but yeah, no problem. What about me and Harry?" she asked, shooting me a flirty glance. Hagrid made an approving grunt. I made a disapproving one. "Come on, Harry, it'll be fun." I just chuckled, handed Hagrid my staff, and vaulted the fence. I thought back to Lily Potter, and how she'd been the one to talk her boyfriend out of doing things that were dangerously stupid. While I imagined we'd have gotten along, just like I got along with Penny and Hermione, she would probably have been mad at me all the time. No, I figured a guy as dumb as me needed a witch that wasn't just going to let him get away with taking mad risks, but was going to instigate every now and again. And despite my reservations, riding a giant winged horse bareback, clinging to my girlfriend while she clung to his feathered mane, skimming along above the lake was fun. Elaine definitely would never have suggested this, or gone along with it. But the witch wrapped in my arms, whose hair smelled of fir and wildflowers, was screaming in joy at the thrill of it. Oh no, I wasn't ready to fall in love again. Was I? Innovation after the weekend, where I was trying very hard not to confront my potential growing feelings for my girlfriend until I absolutely had to. We had our first full week of classes. The front of my week was actually significantly lighter than Thursday and Friday for some reason, with 7 free periods throughout. I wondered if Hogwarts ever considered hiring a few more teachers so they could overcome the chaos that was a schedule designed for each core class professor to handle a dozen different sets of students each week. I knew the place was strapped for cash, but it certainly wasn't hurting for extra classroom space, at least. Monday afternoon, in one of my double free periods, my spell creation group met in our favorite of said empty classrooms. "I think we're just about there," Penny said, gesturing to the arithmancy diagrams we'd set out for the exorcism charm. "It's going to come down to figuring out the right emotion again, though." Sulfur and Hellfire had both proven to be extremely temperamental power sources. Unlike normal spells that you just cast, the Unforgivables and Apologies required you to feel a particular emotion. Figured it had to do with making your own solar proper conduit in the moment for the energy to flow. "It's not random, at least," Alexis suggested. "It's so much easier to cast the Patronus now that we know the happy thought is really more about feeling safe or protecting others. And the pride you need in the target to cast the Libertors also makes sense. So we need to figure out what emotion corresponds to freeing a target of dark influence," Percy nodded. "That at least narrows it down." "Well, show us the wand gestures and we'll get Aunt," Oliver suggested, ever practical. Incantation is Excorio in it. As everyone tried to match the diagrams of wand gestures required, I finally had a leg up on the group. I'd built my unicorn horn focus around the Soulfire matrix, so it ought to be able to cast any of the apologies. I was gradually winning everyone over on the name, with it just by pointing. It definitely worked for the two we'd already mastered. So as everyone else was practicing the elaborate gesture, I was just pointing at things, yelling, "Excorio," and trying to feel different emotions. Not that my head start mattered much. By dinner, we still hadn't landed on it. Maybe it will only work if there's actually a valid target. Penny suggested, getting frustrated. I guess we need to get on the headmaster's schedule, Percy agreed. While Dumbledore had agreed not to just go ahead and destroy Ravenclaw's diadem, which was currently haunted by a piece of Voldemort's soul, he wisely wasn't willing to let us experiment on it without his supervision. One moment of weakness and it could be loose again in the school, a clone of the Dark Lord's mind driving a student's body. I hadn't really helped the headmaster with the explanatory tap dancing required to explain to my friends why the cursed object was basically haunted without reading them fully in on the idea of Horcruxes, which Voldemort used for necromantic immortality. I thought they'd probably all more or less figured it out anyway, and were just being polite about another of his secrets. The next day, basically the same group had our first triple potions period. Oliver had dropped out after fifth year, so we kept our partners for the class, Percy with Alexis and Penny with me. Professor Belby had apologized for his attacks the previous year while under Voldemort's imperious curse, but his hair was still very short. The twins had hit him with something that he hadn't been able to get out without shaving his head. I honestly didn't think he really noticed or cared what his hair looked like. To wit, the inch of graying fuzz was especially interesting on that particular day, looking almost like a dragon's ridges from him wiping his potion-slimed fingers in lines backwards as a nervous habit. Surprisingly, he started class by waving a copy of the prince's potions. "If you don't have a copy of this, I recommend it," he suggested. "It's better than the standard text. Moving on." He probably didn't even know it was my work. Well, it was Severus Snape's work. I just copied the improvements he'd made in the margins when I got his copy of the book second-hand. The Wizarding World's complete inattention to copyright meant, with Remus' help, I was perfectly able to sell copies of the transcription I'd mostly made to share with my friends. Selling a couple dozen to Newt students each year wouldn't be that much money in the grand scheme of things, but it was a nice bit of additional ongoing income, and I appreciated it. "This year," Belby continued, "we're moving on to creation. Your ability to adjust existing recipes is adequate. The dirty secret is that creation isn't that much different. Few potions are truly original. You'll mostly be trying to isolate concepts from known potions and combine them into something new." "What about your wolfsbane potion, sir?" Trudy Stump, the Hufflepuff prefect, asked. "It was originally based on the other mental potions," he admitted. "In fact, why don't we break that down? This week's S will be an analysis of which elements of the Draft of Peace, the Calming Draft, the Witch Sharpening Potion, and the Memory Potion are still present in the recipe for wolfsbane. I'll provide a current copy of the recipe. I've actually managed to improve it a great deal over the summer. Remus had been telling me that working at the school with Belby had been a boon for both of them. They'd managed to get the potion dialed in so it substantially reduced Remus' hangover after a transformation. They were currently working on getting it to be less volatile. Having to be consumed almost immediately after brewing for full potency was a real drawback. I had my own ideas about how to solve that problem with enchanting and was currently working on a stasis thermos to give Remus for Christmas. Belby interrupted my thoughts with, "But also, start planning out what you might want to do for your creation project. Ambition will be rewarded in final grades for this term, and even if you fail, the lessons will serve you in good stead for your newts. I don't want to see another original potion that's just cure for boils, but for acne. It's been done. Your skin will clear up on its own soon anyway." He paused, then barked out, "Dresden, you're bound to have an interesting idea. What do you want to work on?" He wasn't really putting me on the spot. I'd already bugged him about my idea before class, so he knew I was ready. "Some kind of counter for opponents with enhanced speed, sir," I said. "Over the summer, we had a run-in with a vampire who moved so fast she was almost impossible to target." There were several shocked looks from kids around the room, but with Percy and Penny nodding along, it was clear I wasn't exaggerating. "Perfect." "New but attainable," Belby said. "You'll also likely use wit sharpening as a base. Invigoration draft and strengthening solution may also be a good complement so you can move as well as think faster. Also consider elements of Felix Felicis, since that one is as much about improving your intuition as it is about altering your luck. Next, Flinton." He began going around the room. Percy had an even better idea than I had, and wanted to see if he could brew a solution that would basically absorb and denature dark magic. It would be good both for potentially cleansing cursed items and for using as a thrown weapon against the undead. Penny wanted to figure out how to come up with a primer potion that would give an imbiber enough magic for healing potions to work better on them. She claimed it was for use on wizards who were magically exhausted, but most of the class seemed pretty clear that it would also allow muggles to benefit from potions. They normally didn't have enough innate magic for most of them to do much. Alexis, kind of jokingly, suggested a perfume that would get her boyfriend's mind off of Quidditch. Oliver did have a tendency to be distracted by his obsession. Belby thought it was an excellent idea, though since it would be both less unethical than love potions and potentially more useful in a general sense. Honestly, though she seemed embarrassed by getting stuck with her joke, it would probably make her a million galleons if she could get it working. Tuesday out of the way, on Wednesday morning, Madam Hooch was clearly surprised to see me at the open flying period for 7th years. The literally hawk-eyed coach raised a grey eyebrow at seeing me show up. Mr. Dresden, right. Of the students I'd never expect to see out here, you'd be near the top of the list. To what do we owe the pleasure? Oliver grinning at my discomfiture, I asked, "Can you please teach me how to ride a broom without falling off? In case the recent problems with long-distance apparition don't get fixed and stay fixed, I figure I ought to have flying as a backup transportation option." Also, being fully immersed in the magical world since before my 16th birthday meant I still hadn't had the opportunity to learn to drive a car. That was probably something I needed to figure out how to resolve soon after graduating. And I'd have to do it in Britain, where they drove on the wrong side of the road, where I wasn't technically legally present enough to get a Muggle driver's license, and where I'd struggle to afford a decent car with a sturdy enough electrical system that I wouldn't immediately hex it into failure. Maybe I would have to content myself with a bus pass. Fair enough, Dresden, she nodded, smile looking predatory due to her avian eyes. Let's see if we can get you to the point you're not a danger to yourself. Wood, you're on spotting duty for your roommate. Yes, Oliver grinned. Come on, Harry, I finally get to teach you something. He led me over to where Hooch placed a school broom and joked, "You start by holding out your hand and commanding, up." This was going to be a long year. Maeve's maneuvers I'd managed to completely avoid Maeve for the first week and a half, save for our brief public standoff on the train. While I felt like I needed to ultimately do something about her, I didn't know what. I was really good at problems that everyone agreed it was okay to throw dangerous spells at. Death Eaters, werewolves, vampires, and basilisks, no problem. Beautiful young women for whom I was the only one to have a proper understanding that they were up to no good. Those were significantly harder to solve. I mean, I might have a real problem even if everyone agreed it was okay to try to set her on fire. I wasn't exactly sure where I picked up my weird chivalry thing, but I knew it was wrong to hit girls, even if they were immortal eldritch entities with machinations inimical to human life. Of course, I hadn't even blinked trying to blow up Mavra, so maybe I only had a problem fighting pretty girls, and that was a bias I needed to examine. Regardless, my dithering avoidance of Maeve came to an end when I almost literally bumped into her in the hallway on the second weekend of the term. Turned out not even she, Grace, could make having to pace up and down the hallway 3 times to summon the room of requirement door less of a navigational hazard if someone else was coming. I'd just been going over to Ravenclaw Tower to see if Penny wanted to discuss the potions essay, but now I was focused on something more important. What the elf with white dreadlocks and an illusion-thin punk aesthetic was up to this time. "Why are you messing with that?" I asked. As conversation starters went, it was more school bully than righteous defender of the 7th floor, but I was nonplussed seeing her there. I hadn't realized spreading it around to the professors would see Slytherins using our secret room. That was a good point. Don't you have a cool room with a giant snake closer to your dorm? Oh, is this Gryffindor's special room? She asked smugly. Realizing I'd come unarmed to this verbal sparring match, she quickly rolled her eyes and said, "Prefect business. Didn't your friends tell you we've been assigned to try to make sure there aren't any other secrets in the castle that Sirius Black could use to gain entry?" It was also funny, I noticed in passing, that she didn't really push the Irish accent when she was talking to me privately. Her voice took on a tone much more similar to my own American accent. She was very like a conversational mushroom, taking on the flavors around her. I think she even increased her height, subtly to negate some of my ability to loom. She certainly seemed much shorter in mixed company. My prefect friends had actually mentioned that they were tasked with exploring the castle, and I hadn't connected that it would give Maeve free run as well. How'd you even get to be a prefect anyway? I asked. Poor Nerys had such a hard time balancing her prefect duties and her owl studies that she realized she needed all the extra time possible for her newts and relinquished the position. A door finally materialized for the room of requirement, elegant and painted in multiple shades of blue. Coming. She didn't wait for my answer before pushing her way in. I wasn't sure if it was the innate command in her voice that I needed to learn to resist better, that I wanted a clue as to what she was up to, or just that I wanted to finish the argument, but I wound up following her into the room not knowing what she could get away with in there. I bet you suggested that she needed to give up the duties, huh? I asked. Friends, I understand, provide advice. And if she also came to understand that Malfoy patronage would see her in better stead than a silver badge when she graduated, where's the harm? The room Maeve had summoned was like walking into an Escher painting, or perhaps more appropriately, like into the Labyrinth movie, which, I guessed, was based on the same idea. Room was enormous, full of every possible variation of furniture, all twisting in on itself to form different areas on the walls and ceiling, all broken by stairways leading to other doorways at impossible angles. Let me guess, you just tried to think of a normal sitting room, and this is what your twisty brain spat out? I asked. You're lucky you're still more useful to me alive than dead, Harry, she tossed back, playful tone fading, as it usually did when I started actually scoring points. Someday, you may see what's left of others who have been so insolent to me. But no, this was mostly intentional, to see if I could stretch the capabilities of the room. It seems limited to providing furniture it actually has in its storage, because that wasn't what I imagined. And she tried to take one of the stairways that emerged out of the wall at the wrong angle and wasn't able to stand on it. It seems limited to gravity that reflects the rest of the castle. It actually amazed me that she was thinking these things through scientifically, and it worried me because I hadn't thought to test the room's limits like this. I wasn't even sure I could imagine a room request this involved. It would have been a cool place to hang out if we could have different groups on the ceiling, I admitted. But that's not all, she said, walking up one of the stairways that was oriented correctly to climb and throwing open the door at the top. Observe. I followed up so I could see through the door, and my mind was blown. I recognized the back room of Honeydukes that the closed secret passage once emptied into. She just created a portal probably a half-mile away into Hogsmeade. How is that possible? She shrugged, closing the door. Everything I just showed you is yours to share. I'll be telling the head girl myself. Think of how dangerous this could be with someone inside the castle controlling it, or if it could somehow be summoned from outside. I trooped back down the stairs, thinking of how this all could work, especially given how comparatively backwards ancient magic had been. How long had they labored to enchant this room, and then kept it a secret? But I have a theory, Maeve continued, walking over and leaning against an incongruous marble column that rose to support the room. And that theory falls within your gesh, Harry Blackstone Copperfield, Dresden. From what I've observed, none would believe you anyway. That theory is that this room is an accident, a natural consequence of the intrusion of this school into the Never Never, what they call wizard space. They didn't create it so much as confine it. Thoughts? I nodded. I was actually kind of surprised to see Maeve thinking things through instead of just being a queen bee mean girl. The castle was full of space expansions that required pushing into the Never Never, and that could create some kind of spatial imbalance that needed to be anchored and contained. That would make sense. She smiled like a shock. This space is the domain of the Never Never. The wizards hid it. The wizards likely feared it. They forfeited it. Before I realized what she was doing or could even consider stopping her, her left hand lit with blue, freezing flames, and she used her index finger to sketch a fey rune on the column. It left behind a trail of ice and the black of frostbite. Witnessed by a wizard protector of Hogwarts, I claim this room for the winter court. So I say it, so mote it be. As my brain kicked into gear that I needed to stop her too late, I tried to dive toward her, but suddenly the Escheresque properties of the room surged, and everything twisted. Though she was only standing a few yards away, it was like she was across a great chasm, my feet leading me at oblique lines to where I wanted to go as the room suddenly fought my attempts to reach her. Thanks for your help, Harry. I couldn't have done it without you. The smug dismissal hurt more for knowing she couldn't lie. This hadn't been a chance encounter after all. Don't worry, I plan to lease it back to the school at very generous rates. None of the students or teachers but you and I will even know anything has changed. And it will remain that way because you can't tell anyone. I felt the gesh snap hold of my tongue. Where before the prohibition against sharing her secrets was subtle to the point that I had to test it to even notice, this prohibition was enforced. I could tell there wouldn't be any dancing around it, or leading Luna or Mathilda to the truth with half-finished statements. Just a representative, huh? I scoffed at her, referring to her statement the year before about her intentions. It's hard to represent an institution with no power in it, she shrugged with languid nonchalance. I should have just kept avoiding her. Chapter 34, Hexcon 6, Spirit Guide. Chapter text next best thing I felt pretty fully outmatched. Whatever the Winter Court was up to, they were so many steps ahead of me, it wasn't even fair. After consulting with Barb, my skull-bound spirit research assistant, I was pretty sure I could unweave the binding Maeve had put on the Room of Requirement. Except I couldn't figure out what she'd wished for to get that particular room. And maybe she just used her control to lock it out as an option for me, regardless. My attempts were pretty limited, in general. Once the staff found out the room could be used to generate doors to seemingly anywhere in Hogwarts or even near the grounds, they got very particular about scheduling access. Some new portraits were hung in that hallway, as well as a couple of suits of armor, which I hadn't confirmed could animate into castle guardians, but seemed pretty likely. At least my first substitute day for Remus was a distraction from my failure to prevent Fey plots. Since most of my classes were self-paced anyway, it wasn't a big deal for me to miss my own classes one day a month. So on Friday, the 1st of October, the sixth years were surprised to find me sitting at Remus' desk when they showed up for the first period. Well, Mathilda wasn't surprised, and the other Gryffindor Newt students weren't, but the rest of the class didn't seem to have realized that I was going to be the substitute their professor had mentioned. Fortunately, Maeve didn't seem to be in this class. I suspected she had dropped all of her practical magic classes after Owls, if I was right that she couldn't really do magic in the wizarding style. Faking it would be a lot harder at the Newt level. Based on the moon's schedule for the year, I was likely to wind up subbing for the sixth years a lot, and I was pleased to get to see my girlfriend and not my nemesis. Who wants to work on soul magic? I asked, surprisingly more comfortable at the front of the classroom than I'd expected. It helped that Mathilda was giving me a thumbs up from the front row. I know the Patroness is technically beyond Newt level, but with the Dementors floating around, it would be good to know. Professor Lupin figured I'd be a good choice to focus on that with you guys, since my friends and I have had a lot of luck getting it to work. And once you've got that down, I can start teaching you the new charm we developed that can break the Imperious curse. My biggest limitation was going to be wand gestures, but fortunately, Mathilda had those down despite not having a ton of luck on a corporeal patroness so far. She could at least get silver mist consistently. I kind of figured that, like I'd been, she was stuck on finding the right memory, and maybe she also needed a dangerous enough situation to force it. With soul magic, I explained to the group after she demonstrated, and they'd tried it to very little success. The biggest problem is getting your emotions right. As near as we can figure, you're basically setting up your soul to resonate with the magic and open a channel for the energy. Unlike most magic, it comes from outside of you. I'll leave exactly from where up to the more religiously inclined. You're not really looking for a happy thought, but one where you're feeling safe and protected, or where you realize that you're needed to protect others. For most people, that's a time when you are happiest, and the memory has to be strong. The group of teens slightly my junior let me natter on about our research into soul magic for the rest of the period between attempts. A couple of the students managed a mist by the end of the class, including one Nerys Orpington, former Slytherin prefect. Maybe she really was better off letting Maeve steal her prefect duties and promise her a cushy job after Hogwarts so she could devote more effort to study. The next class was the Ravenclaw and Slytherin second years. That was an abrupt switch from super advanced casting to nearly the basics, but at least Luna was in the class, so I'd have someone to relate to. I didn't know anyone else from that year outside Gryffindor. You're doing mostly dark creatures, right? Has Professor Lupin given you a higher-level discussion of how to fight them yet? I asked. I definitely wanted to avoid having to try to teach spells to second years. I wasn't even sure what the wand motion was for the disarming charm. Like, how to fight them once you're better at magic. One of the Ravenclaw kids asked. Was he a muggle-born that knew about fantasy games? I might have to keep an eye on him. No, sorry. High level, like the big picture that you'd see if you were way high up. Not like your fighting level is high, I corrected. Basically, an annoying number of creatures are resistant to magic. Your best spells just wash right off. In the last couple of years, I've had that problem with ogres, trolls, lucrata, werewolves, and a basilisk. Tell us about the basilisk. One of the Slytherin kids demanded, excited. Fine. But during story time, I want everyone to think about what we wound up having to do instead of just relying on spells. Because if you encounter a creature that's magic resistant, you need to get creative with the environment and your other tools. You should probably not get too reliant on your magic in general to solve all your problems. Third period was my own year. We didn't really need a professor in class for most of the stuff we were working on anyway, so everyone just broke up into groups to discuss their own projects. Day going well so far? Oliver asked. I never realized 12-year-olds had so many questions, I answered. At least Luna didn't ask me about blibbering humdingers until after class. I was glad I was able to eat lunch before I had to deal with the Ravenclaw Slytherin fifth years. That year was most of the Slytherin Quidditch team, including Flint's former Stooges Pusey and Montague that I'd had standoffs with in the past before their former captain got expelled. Fortunately, Mortimer Lindquist, the Ectomancer, was also in that class, so I managed to fill the period by engaging him in a discussion of the differences between ghosts and wraiths, as well as helping people on their essays that they were pleased to discover they got another weekend to work on. Finally, in the middle of the afternoon, I got my biggest challenge. Harry, where's Professor Lupin? Hermione demanded as soon as she entered the classroom. He had some business to take care of with his muggle career. I told them the lie we'd rehearsed. It wouldn't be long before someone taking defense against the dark arts noticed if he was sick after every full moon. I personally thought this lie wouldn't last too long either. The kids took an astronomy class, so they had to keep track of the full moon. But at least it was plausible. He's going to try to schedule it for the weekends, but when he can't, I'll be subbing for him. The bushy-headed prodigy nodded, apparently buying it, but I thought I saw Neville, of all people, give me a suspicious look. Hermione gushed. Well, that's good, because we've been talking about red caps, and I was thinking that since you actually fought some this summer, you could tell us more about them. Thanks, Hermione. Yeah, that's the plan. Now the thing about red caps is that they're vicious. The final period of the day was the same combo of Gryffindor Hufflepuff, but 1 year higher. The fourth years were still on curses, so I got to basically steal Quirrell's speech about categorizing curses and unforgivables. But I also put my own spin on it with less moral equivocation. The unforgivables were actually using hellfire, and using magic to torture and kill actually damaged your soul. I wasn't totally sure everyone believed me, but it was a much better argument for not using them than just, they're too good at getting through shields, so got outlawed, which was basically Quirrell's position. I expected he'd believed that even before he got possessed, which was probably why he wound up serving as Voldemort's spirit horse in the first place. After dinner, I just collapsed on one of the Gryffindor sofas. Teaching was exhausting. You did such a good job today, babe. Mathilda told me, sitting on the arm of the couch and tousling my hair. So good. In fact, everyone thinks you were better than Quirrell and Lockhart, maybe not as good as Lupin. So if the curse isn't really over, and you're going to need a job next year, woman, don't you put that juju on me, I tiredly exclaimed. The curse that had prevented most defense professors from lasting more than a year had turned out to be the consequence of the fortunamancy wards dumping bad luck on the current defense professor whenever they saved a life. I need those fortune wards trying to save me. If they turn against me, I'm toast. We both giggled at the thought of me without any kind of safety net. But seriously, Dumbledore better have fixed those stupid wards. Tricky Treats another month blew by quickly, at least from the outside. When you look back at your life, it's annoying to realize the moments of sheer terror are the ones that really left a mark. A whole month of learning, working on projects, and deepening relationships, and there's nothing really to mention. As soon as a madman shows up, though, it's a memory. Humans are weird. Speaking of the inevitable madman, the end of October was a looming excitement. My 18th birthday coincided, as always, with Halloween, but this year also with a Hogsmeade weekend. The excitement was only slightly diminished by the increased vulnerability to Sirius Black and the Dementors set to pursue him while I was out of the castle. It was also sad because that Saturday night was a full moon, which meant Remus couldn't even enjoy the weekend, and Tonks couldn't be on hand as Aura backup in the guise of spending the day with her boyfriend. But hey, 18. While it was a year past my wizarding adulthood, I'd grown up Muggle and 18 felt like the real win. I wasn't really sure how to register for the Muggle privileges, though. I knew we'd been kept in the Muggle system so Elaine, and I could go to school in America, but that had slipped since I'd been in Britain. I wondered if there were caseworkers in the us who thought I'd died. Anyway, Hogsmeade, birthday weekend. Did you know that when you're a magical adult, they can't stop you from just fluing elsewhere? I mean, they probably could, especially when you're bringing your technically still underage girlfriend. But hey, Rosmutter, going to use the flu so I'm not a sitting duck here for Sirius Black really stops innkeeping cougars from asking too many questions. I would like to make a brief aside to note that it's weird that everyone is so into a witch in her 50s, right? Even with the increased magical lifespan. She's a very nice-looking middle-aged lady, for sure, but Madame Rosmutter isn't that much younger than Professor McGonagall, and yet she seems to be every Hogwarts boy's first crush. Is it the magic of finally letting 13-year-olds into Hogsmeade right when puberty is starting to kick off? It has to be, right? One thing that had never really entered my head regarding my girlfriend being a pureblood is that most non-Weasley purebloods are wealthy. When we fell out of the flu into an elite dining establishment for the birthday lunch she was treating me to, I asked, "Wow, can you afford this?" This level of hardwood and crystal indicated the kind of place I'd maybe considered someday entering through the servants' entrance. I wasn't even sure where we were, but the view was an amazing glimpse of sea and islands. If you were willing to rely on magical transportation, building your business in an established magical neighborhood was purely optional. "Why, Mr. Dresden," Mathilda tried a sultry pout, "are you saying you're not with me for my money?" "I legitimately never considered it," I told her, planting a kiss on the top of her head. "But now that I realize gold digging's an option," she leaned her shoulder forcefully into my ribs. "Nope, Laura Jigger took her shot, and you didn't even notice. Laura was a Hufflepuff in my year. I vaguely remembered she had been trying to chat me up in classes a couple of years prior." The last name seemed familiar. Maybe her family had money from potions. "You're going to have to settle for mere dragon money." "Oh, right." I knew Mathilda's family was from Wales and that Welsh Greens were one of the British breeds of dragon, but I hadn't really made the connection that the Grimblehawks probably came by their obsession with magical beasts by owning lots of land on which said beasts lived. I misquoted Bilbo at her. "No thanks. I didn't come for presents. I only wished to see if you were truly as great as they say. I didn't believe them." "Do you now?" she asked. "Truly songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality. Mathilda Grimblehawk, chiefest and greatest of the calamities." I said, quietly hugging her. "You have nice manners for a wizard," she grinned, leaning up to kiss me after finishing the quote. "Ahem," the hostess chose then to show back up. Not in a rush, Mathilda eventually drew back out the kiss and told the witch, "Grimblehawk, reservation for two." The lunch was probably better than any meal I'd eaten up to that point. I won't try to dignify the sense memories with words. Suffice it to say, the difference between regular people food and rich people food is reflected in more than the visual presentation. We didn't make it back to Hogsmeade until mid-afternoon and joined a triple date with our friends, already in progress. at the Three Broomsticks. Alexis was celebrating forcing Oliver to take the weekend off from the last month's obsessive Quidditch practice prior to the first match the following weekend. Penny and Percy were celebrating that Dumbledore had told them that his friend, Saul, at the Department of Mysteries, had been very pleased with our Liberator's charm and was anxiously awaiting the rest of the apologies. They figured their post-Hogwarts jobs were in the bag. I had absently wondered whether the Doom of Damocles would keep me from getting a job with them. But as much as I loved tinkering with magic, I wasn't sure I could do it as a career. The members of the Department of Mysteries probably never borrowed a hippogriff for a ride with their girlfriends or slew enormous basilisks. Was it weird that the terror of that moment faded, but the victory remained? Speaking of terrifying moments, less than an hour into hanging out squeezed into a booth in the corner of the packed Three Broomsticks Inn, we heard shrieking from the street outside. Nobody at the table even blinked at piling out to go see what was going on. If you took an aerial photograph of the crowd heading out to look at a crisis, you could probably neatly diagram them into Hogwarts houses, with Gryffindor first and closest to the danger. We were a really bad influence on one Penelope Clearwater, Ravenclaw prefect, who had once had a whole long life of safe research ahead of her before all her friends were Gryffindors. From my position at the head of the pile of the House of the Reckless, who were, themselves, at the head of the rest of the houses that had vomited forth from the doors of the Three Broomsticks, I saw Hermione, Neville, Ron, and Seamus doing a truly impressive sprint down the street, probably from the Honeyduke's candy shop. Give the third years their due. All four of them had discovered cardio. They'd actually started doing some light exercise after all the running from danger they'd had to do the past couple of years, and they were putting in a pretty impressive sprint for wizards. Sirius Black, Neville wheezed, charging the crowd like he was playing a Red Rover game. Remember the inevitable madman. Sure enough, not far behind, the same oversized butt-mangy black hound that we'd seen at Diagon Alley, and on the overpass above the train, was bursting from Honeyduke's behind a bunch of other shopping students. Secret passage is closed, asshole. I yelled, charging down the road, staff aloft. Even going to a fancy lunch, I wasn't going to leave my staff, because I could, eventually, learn lessons about the dangers of not having the proper foci when danger happened. I often took my staff to the bathroom those days. You know what escaped murderers probably don't expect? They don't expect some dumb jerk to charge them when they're in the middle of scaring off a bunch of young teenagers. A block down, the skeletally thin black hound turned to face me and cocked his head in doggy confusion. While I hadn't actually thought it through before I started running, I wasn't really that worried about him in dog form. Animagi weren't spell resistant, and even McGonagall couldn't manage wandless magic in her animal form. While it was probably ideal for terrorizing adolescents and hiding in muggle areas, a big black dog wasn't great for fighting a wizard. Scratch that. I was a terrible influence on all my friends. A big black dog wasn't ideal for fighting a single trained wizard, and it was way overmatched when facing an entire screaming horde of Gryffindor students pelting down the Hogsmeade strip. I was even pretty sure that Hermione's crew had hung a 180 and joined the fun when they realized how many reinforcements they had. The dog blinked. The dog fled. He cut behind the post office and made a break for the nearby woods. A rousing, unplanned battle charge tends to lose cohesion when the enemy jukes left and legs it down an alley. While I and my nearest friends kept rushing toward the corner where we lost him, about half the crowd turned right at the near side of the post office and tried to cut him off. Probably a few people turned left in case he'd somehow doubled back and apparated to the other side of town. This meant that we were spread out across Hogsmeade by the time the secondary effect of shouting Sirius Black in the middle of town manifested itself. The Dementors arrived. If the charge hadn't already been broken by the target, turning on his furry haunches and fleeing, it would have ended when the black-shrouded figures began flying into town, pushing an aura of despair before them. Someone, a million miles away, shouted, "Dementors." Another voice suggested, "Back into the inn." That was all I understood before I was back in Azkaban. The dark walls of the cell pressed in, and I had no memories but the fact that I'd accidentally killed my mentor and girlfriend. Everything else, over 2 years at Hogwarts, must have been a fever dream. I felt myself falling on cobblestones that might have been the floor of the jail cell. It was where I belonged. Murderer. Pretty soon, the Black Spectre of Lord Voldemort would be coming back. It would be bringing an immense snake, a murderous werewolf, and a beautiful white-haired girl that hid knives behind her smile. A dozen Dementors bearing down on my position were harder to disagree with than just the single one on the train. I was nothing. I belonged here. Harry, a voice I vaguely recognized, swam through my dark thoughts. Harry, the pretty girl insisted, reddish-brown hair falling into her face as she looked where I'd fallen to the ground. Sirius Black is that way, the girl insisted, gesturing angrily at dark shapes that swarmed in the air. Dus I ch worry efo dinane, expecto patronum. Something silver erupted from her wand as she crouched protectively over me. The Dementors fled, and I passed out. Dumb Spiro Sparrow, the Dementors didn't catch Sirius Black. Obviously, they didn't catch him, because for some reason, they continued to be more interested in incapacitating me than in doing their jobs. Several other kids with traumas in their pasts had apparently also collapsed when the creatures swept in. But fortunately, 5 patronesses had been enough to drive off the central mass, and most of the students had fled into buildings when they heard Black was on the loose. I was starting to think we should have prioritized inventing the sulfur charm, which, being the opposite of the killing curse, we theorized could destroy wraiths and dementors. I really kind of wanted to blow up a few of those jerks after what was looking like an intentional set of attacks on me. One small victory was that most of us were basically right in front of Honeydukes when the Dementors showed up, and the shopkeep decided to sell their chocolate at a discount for the rest of the day, as well as free samples for those most affected. After the attack on Saturday, few people wanted to go into town on Sunday. Remus contacted me at lunch to say that he'd had a pretty bad night of it, worried about Black being confirmed to be in town, but he thought he would be recovered enough to teach classes on Monday. I told him to take the morning off, at least. Sunday also brought Muggle news, which further clouded the day. There had been an era-related massacre in Ireland, which just capped off a month that had also seen at least 2 more bombings. We hadn't been able to talk Penny out of keeping up with the news, despite her inability to do anything about it from Hogwarts. She was taking it all very personally, especially since 2 of the people killed in the shooting had basically been our age, just young adults out at a Halloween party. My friends, only Mathelda and Luna had completely bought into the idea that Maeve was a representative of the Fae, and that was probably the only thing that kept Penny from dramatically confronting the she-princess. The Halloween feast on Sunday night raised flagging spirits, but it was hard to feel like the world wasn't on some kind of dangerous brink. In fact, I pretty much expected that the Winter Court was doing everything it could to help push it there, out of some ineffable political ends. Overall, I'd rate my 18th birthday weekend as A+, O+ if you're a British wizard for meals, but not great otherwise. Well, Mathelda making extra sure I was recovered after the Dementors, once we got back to the castle, didn't suck either. Speaking of, the main reason I'd been adamant about still taking Remus morning classes on Monday was that the 6th years were up again during second period. On either side, I had both sets of first years, and they were as interested in story time as the second years had been, so that made those classes easy. But I really wanted to give Mathelda a chance to show off. All right, everyone, it's been a month. How are those patronesses coming? I asked her class first thing. There had been marked improvements since I'd first showed them. Most of the class was able to get the silver mist, and a few were even up to the shield. I was happy to see that the few Slytherins in the class weren't the ones that couldn't get anything. But there weren't many of them, so probably the ones already into dark magic in a soul-damaging way had dropped the class after Owls. I'd saved Mathelda for last, and gave her a smile as it was her turn. She grinned back, met my eyes, and incanted, expecto patronum. I hadn't actually been cognizant enough in Hogsmeade to note her imago. Given her interests, I'd expected some form of awesome magical beast, so I was surprised when the silvery animal that formed was a slightly smaller, sleeker version of Mouse, a lioness dog to the lion-like dog that I summoned. "Ha! That looks just like Dresden's," one of the Slytherins noted, while the Hufflepuffs and other Gryffindors praised her for getting a fully corporeal patroness. A couple of the smarter kids who'd done the full reading gave us speculative looks. "All right, everyone, good job," I said, a little flustered. "Keep practicing. Done, Wakefield. I think you're both almost there, you're just overthinking it. Catch up with me or Professor Lupin if you want some one-on-one tutoring. Class dismissed." I waited until almost everyone had filed out before taking Mathilda's hand and asking, "Talk tonight." I hoped I didn't make her nervous, but I needed to figure out what to say and had more first years showing up in a few minutes. "Sure," she replied, seemingly unconcerned, giving my hand a squeeze and then heading out. Honestly, I wasn't sure if Mathilda was ever really that nervous. My first period after lunch was my own year's defense class, and Remus made it, looking much better than he had the previous day. While the rest of the class was working on individual projects, I managed to have a conversation catching him up on the morning's classes. "Good for Mathilda," Remus nodded, when I got to that part. "I take it she figured it out during the affray on Saturday." I agreed. Yeah, everyone else was spread out, and I was out of it from so many so close, so she had a powerful incentive to finally break that last mental block, I guess. He smiled wanly. If only it weren't horribly unsafe to take everyone on a field trip to attempt it under real conditions. There is always something to be said for field experience. "At least I have a lot of that," I said. Lowering my voice enough that only a werewolf or someone with hearing as good as mine might be able to pick it out, I asked, "So, her patroness is basically a copy of mine. Is that always a signifier of—" Remus' look was musing, but he nodded. "There are few enough people that can cast that spell that I don't think there has been a truly scientific study of the form it takes. But yes, in all recorded instances that I'm aware of, the only time a couple didn't share the same creature was when the relationship was very new or eventually fell apart. Is it a sign of true love or just shared resonance? That's for the poets to decide." He grinned, "But congratulations nonetheless. It's certainly easier to believe a spell conjured from the very soul than mere words." "Thanks," I told him. I got so deep in my own thoughts that I didn't really notice class ending or my friends leading me to our classroom for Monday afternoon spell research. "You okay, Harry?" Penny asked. "Yeah," I said, shaking my head to clear it. "Yeah, another round of trying to find the right emotion." I asked. We still hadn't figured out how to cast the exorcism charm and had spent the last few sessions doing more arithmancy work on the soulfire charm instead. "The headmaster is joining us later," Percy nodded. I wasn't convinced having the diadem on hand to try to target was really helping, but it seemed to focus everyone else. Field experience, like Remus had said. After a few minutes of 5 people trying different ways to cast a spell, an endless litany of exscorio. In every imaginable cadence and tone of voice, my mind started to drift again. In a very real way, I'd shut down after the fire. I'd always thought Elaine and I loved each other. The signs had been clear for Justin's betrayal in hindsight, and I'd picked up on them intuitively. But even if he'd put Elaine under the Imperius, I think part of my mind believed that if she'd really loved me, she'd have been able to break free. I certainly could, though I had no idea how powerful Justin's curse was. I had to admit, part of my reticence to date again had been out of a belief that if someone as closely bonded to me as Elaine didn't really love me, maybe nobody could. A therapist would probably have a field day working through my abandonment issues. Mother I'd never known, father that loved me but died when I was little, orphanage, ultimately murderous foster father, maniacal godmother. I'd probably put an awful lot on Elaine, without even realizing it, to be my one loving relationship. After all, she hadn't even really chosen me. We'd just been the only one the other had in Justin's dysfunctional training program. But Mathilda had chosen me. She'd done nothing, but no matter how many times I'd tried to push her away, I'd do anything in my power to ensure that no one would ever cast an unforgivable at her. But I realized, I believed that the Imperius wouldn't be sufficient to get her to betray me. Maybe I was wrong to assume that I'd die alone. The proof was right there in her soul magic. Speaking of soul magic, Harry, Earth to Harry, Penny's voice cut through my musings. "You did it." "What?" I asked. "You've been getting a spell effect the last 3 times you cast the charm." The exasperated Ravenclaw witch was basically shouting at me as my other 3 friends looked on in amusement. What emotion were you using? I was kind of spaced out, I admitted. I think. I nodded, realizing what I'd been thinking about, summoned up that feeling and cast Excorio. A burst of silver and white light like television static blasted from my unicorn horn focus at the classroom wall. I smiled. Hope. It took everyone else a few minutes to dial it in. I had to be a bit poetic, getting them to draw on the feeling they got when they truly believed that good things were coming, that even though the day was dark, the sun would rise again, that even when the servants of the darkness seemed to be winning, ultimately good would triumph. I may have stolen some of Sam's lines to Frodo from Lord of the Rings to get the point across. One by one, excoriating static started to burst from everyone's wands as they found the right feeling of optimism. It probably came easy to Gryffindors. After all, a lot of courage was just the hope that this stupid, reckless thing you were going to do would turn out all right. Penny was the last one and was getting frustrated. Percy pulled her aside, and I couldn't help but overhear, "Are you okay, Pen?" he asked her. "I guess I'm just finding it hard to believe things will get better," she admitted. "Ever since the bombing this summer, I feel like there's a Dementor following me around all the time. It doesn't matter how many good people there are. The bad people will always be there to kill the innocent just to score some stupid political point. Sirius Black made it into the damned candy shop, and the people that were supposed to protect us just dropped Dementors on our head." Her voice rose so no one in the room could fail to hear, "And no matter what we do, Tom Riddle keeps coming back, every stupid year." Before Percy could work out what to tell her, Dumbledore walked into the classroom, bearing the warded box he kept the cursed diadem in. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he asked with a twinkle. I hid a smirk, wondering how long he'd been hiding outside the classroom waiting for a good moment. "No, sir," Percy told him. "We actually have made a breakthrough. If you could set out the diadem." As the headmaster opened the box and dumped the silver and sapphire jewelry on the table, Percy turned back to his girlfriend. "Penny, it will get better. Evil has to hide in the dark because it knows that society abhors it. Certainly, we will never prevent every atrocity. But for every stone that they kick over, we will raise up 10 more. And you know who is not eternal. No matter what he planned for, he did not plan for a brilliant muggle-born witch who would show us all how to defeat him." He cupped her face in his hand. "No matter how dark it gets, you are the light. Do not let them trick you into going out." Nodding, taking in a deep, shuddering breath, Penny closed her eyes, thinking, then pointed her wand at the tainted artifact. Opening them with a new resolve, she exhaled, Excorio. Penny's spell connected her to the diadem on a pulsing column of silver sparks, sulfur swarming over the object. I saw her grit her teeth and double down, the dark enchantment not willing to give up without a fight. A keening wail began to emerge from the cursed diadem, and Dumbledore stepped farther back, readying his wand to defend us if necessary. But with one final shriek that sounded so much like Voldemort's anger, a cloud of darkness flew from the relic and quickly evaporated into the air. When Penny ended the spell, it almost seemed like an invisible tarnish had been removed. Dumbledore quickly did several detection spells and broke into a huge smile when it came back clean. Tears running down her face at the success, Penny and Percy embraced. This time, I managed to tune out whatever they were saying to each other as far too private for my ears. I instead walked over and gave Dumbledore the synopsis. "It does seem appropriate," he nodded. "The young are our hope for the future. Where I would have destroyed the diadem and forever lost a priceless relic, you've all given it back to us. With hearts and minds like yours on our side, I think this old man might be able to hope again as well." It looked like Penny and Percy had finished their moment, and he asked, "Ms. Clearwater, would you like to do the honors?" She nodded and stepped forward, but Dumbledore raised a finger and said, "Actually, wait one moment. I believe we need a few more witnesses." 10 minutes later, we were joined by Flitwick McGonagall and, surprisingly, the Grey Lady, a castle ghost that had remained mute the few times I'd encountered her. "As promised, Helena, your mother's diadem has been freed." I suggested that the Ravenclaw student who removed the taint should be allowed to try it on, Dumbledore told the ghost. She nodded, voice hollow from disuse. "It never worked for me, else I should have not gotten us to this state. It does seem appropriate that she who undid my folly should attempt to bear the diadem once more." With the approval of her house ghost and Flitwick's obvious trembling excitement, Penny lifted the diadem and tentatively placed it upon her head. After she didn't say anything for most of a minute, just looked like she was thinking, the diminutive professor couldn't wait any longer and asked, "Well, I think, actually, I'm sure of it," Penny began. "Obviously, you know how you have second thoughts about solutions. If it's doing anything, I think it's squashing those before I can talk myself out of the right answer. It's like I can hear a voice in the back of my head telling me to go with my gut. You know, they've actually done studies that second-guessing yourself makes you turn a right answer into a wrong one more often than the opposite. It's a little like being under the liberatus. Actually, I just feel more confident about my answers." The ghost smiled sadly. Perhaps it did work for me after all, then. And let that be a warning, for I was quite confident that stealing it from my mother was the right answer. Thought for a second. We were estranged in the first place because she was always so certain she was right about everything. I wonder if we would have had a better relationship had she not invented the diadem. Flitwick seemed sad at that counterpoint, well warned, but we shall fully examine it and see if we can determine exactly what it's doing. Ms. Clearwater, if you're finished. One moment, sir, she grinned, before I second-guess myself out of it, and she turned and gave Percy a giant kiss. Everyone politely turned away, but I caught the grey lady looking wistfully at the couple. I excused myself, not actually willing to wait until after dinner, and made my way down to the hallway outside the potions lab to wait for Mathilda to get out of her afternoon class. Fortunately, I'd timed it right. Belby rarely actually required the full triple period for Newt potions, so let people out early often, and I didn't have to wait long. I motioned her over to an alcove nearby, probably the same one where I'd wound up negotiating with Draco a year and a half earlier. Noticing Maeve give me a calculating look as she left gave me a primer on where to start. I waited until everyone else was clear and said, "There are still things I can't tell you. Not that I don't want to tell you, that I can't." I still hadn't figured out how to get around my oath to my godmother, even though Mathilda had figured out a lot about Maeve. "I get it. You have some kind of gesh that keeps you from telling me those secrets. And I still feel like you don't know everything and it's dangerous." I put up a hand to stop her from telling me I didn't have to protect her. "But I know that you don't care about that. I should let you trust that I'm doing my best that you don't get hurt by the things I can't talk about and be ready to back me up if they become a problem anyway." That got a nod. "And I realized today that I've been trying to protect myself as much as you, because I didn't have much hope for the future after everything that's happened to me. Harry, I know I don't know everything that happened to you, but from what I do know, that makes sense. Right, and I'm saying that I've been trying to push you away because I didn't think I deserved to be with anyone else. I think I was just using Elaine as an excuse. My nightmares aren't about her anymore. They're about bad things happening to you. Babe, you don't have to convince me you're over your ex. I've never actually been worried about that, you know. I don't think so, at least." I nodded, trying to explain what I was trying to get to, and said, I didn't want you to have the patroness thing out there and be hanging on, wondering, and I'm just going to say it. Mathilda Grimblehawk, I love you." Her eyes twinkled in amusement in the torchlight, and she gave me her best Han Solo face. "I know." Chapter 35, Hexcon 7, Black Magic. Chapter text: Party crash wizards were all insane. It was the only explanation for why they hadn't cancelled the Quidditch match. Mathilda and I huddled together under a cloak spelled to be waterproof, because we'd already lost her umbrella off the back of the stands in the fierce wind. At least the driving rain of the thunderstorm wasn't as freezing as it could be in Scotland in November. But it was so thick that it was hard to make out what was going on, except when literal bolts of lightning struck nearby and illuminated the match like a camera flash. I actually noticed Colin Creevy, perfectly adapted to wizarding madness despite his muggle upbringing, trying to time his photographs to the lightning strikes. If it wouldn't have broken Oliver's heart to hear I hadn't watched the match, I'd have stayed inside. If I didn't have close relationships with at least 5 of the players on the field, I'd have gone back in when we lost the umbrella. If my girlfriend wasn't such a fan, I'd have dragged us away when the lightning started. I am a wizard, so I guess I was as insane as the rest of them. Most of the match was little more than sense impression under the misery of the small hurricane we were stuck in. Lee Jordan, the Weasley twins' roommate and co-conspirator, was doing his best to call the match, but even his amplified voice would often be drowned out by the wind and thunder. Periodically, I'd see one of the twins or the Slytherin beaters fly close to our side of the stands to intercept a bludger, or at least where they thought one was. Above, when I risked looking up and getting water in my eyes, I could sometimes see flashes of red or platinum hair as Ginny and Draco tried to find the snitch in the maelstrom. "Isn't this intense?" Mathilda yelled and clutched her arms harder around my chest, clearly thrilled. "Okay, maybe it wasn't all bad. That's one word for it. Who's winning?" I shouted back. I couldn't see the scoreboard from where I was. "I think it's close," she answered. "It will probably come down to the snitch." Like it didn't always. "Ronald, put your cloak back on. If you get sick, Mother will yell at me." I heard Percy screaming at his youngest brother, where the boy was just letting himself get soaked at the front of the Gryffindor stands while he cheered on the team. Seamus was right there with him, hooting like a madman every time he thought he saw a good play. Even Hermione and Neville seemed swept up in their friend's enthusiasm, though they held tightly to the umbrella they were sharing. "It's fine," Penny chided him loudly, from where they were sitting next to Mathilda on our right. "Nothing a little pepper-up potion won't fix. Ollie owes me for this." Alexis complained from her seat beside me to the left, grimly huddled under her own cloak. At least one of the witches in my life was sane. "And Ginny Weasley has seen the snitch," Lee announced. I could barely make out the tiny redhead trying to make her second-hand broom climb against the storm. The Weasleys had used some of their prize money over the summer to at least get her a decent used comet, rather than the ancient school broom she'd been using the previous year. But it wasn't anything like the rocket ship that Draco rode, and even though he was half the field away, he was quickly catching up, white blonde hair a visible smear in the rain. Of course, moments before we were finally going to go inside, that was when the Dementors decided to show up. They were far enough away that the feeling of despair was muted, but the black shapes were unmistakable even against the storm clouds if you expected them to be there, perfect black against the mere darkness. And the Seekers were so focused on a tiny golden ball that they didn't seem to have noticed. "Dementors!" I yelled, already unwrapping my arm from Mathilda and fishing out my unicorn horn focus. My scream of "Expecto Patronum" was quickly matched by my friends. Alexis, Penny, and Percy's patronesses spread into the air to protect the crowd. Mathilda's and my matched pair shot upwards toward Ginny and Draco. Word had gotten around about Mathilda's patroness later in the week, and Penny, after effusively congratulating her for both mastering the spell and upgrading our relationship, demanded that we rename the silvery dogs Mickey and Minnie. She settled for calling Mathilda's Minnie, and that name had stuck. The non-Muggle-born weren't very familiar with Disney. Mouse and Minnie, however, weren't quite fast enough, and Draco was already seizing up upon getting too close to the happiness-consuming monsters. It was hard to make out at the distance, and in the rain, but I suspected it was exactly the tremors of someone remembering being put under the Cruciatus curse. My godmother had a lot to answer for. The Malfoy heir lost his grip on his broom and fell, the expensive nimbus shooting off on a long arc caught in the wind. I could faintly hear Ginny shout, "Draco," and wheel her own broom around. Using the exact same maneuver she'd used to win her match against him the last year, she turned a fall into a powered dive, catching up to her falling rival and attempting to grab and pull him aboard her own broom as our patronesses flew past them and scattered the pursuing Dementors. The smaller girl on the cheaper broom might not have been enough, but a barrage of well-timed levitation charms from Hermione's crew and Colin managed to do a passable imitation of a shotgun, a couple of them hitting even the fast-moving pair and latching onto their clothing to slow them to a drift well before hitting the ground. I absently noted a few other corporeal patronesses covering the rest of the stadium, probably Oliver's, Remus, and Dumbledore's, and the amplified voice of the headmaster was yelling at the Dementors to leave, seeming angrier than I'd ever heard him. But why had they come? I let my patroness end as I frantically looked around, not at all surprised when I found a pair of red eyes surrounded by dark fur crouched atop the Gryffindor stands. who knew how long he'd been lurking behind empty seats waiting for me to be distracted. Seeing that he was primed to pounce, and with only my apologies focus ready to hand, I imagined a better future and unleashed the spell I'd been drilling all week, Exscorio. While we hadn't had time to do a full set of experiments in the week since we'd gotten the charm working, we had cast it on each other a few times, because we were still kind of dumb teenagers who didn't have a lot of respect for experimental safety protocols. It didn't do anything to most of us, but I felt twinges of guilt under it. We theorized it was that my soul was still slightly damaged from Justin's death. Our assumption was that against an actual dark wizard with a shredded soul, like mass murderer Sirius Black, it should be an almost incapacitating torment of emotions. That wasn't what actually happened. My blast of silvery static nailed the big, black dog, but he reacted more like the diadem had than like I had. I could hear a wail that reminded me of Voldemort's wraith. The red lights in the dog's eyes went out, and shadows seemed to flicker around him. Unfortunately, unlike a diadem, a living being could move. I only managed to hold him under for a moment, particularly because I was so surprised at the reaction, and the dog dodged under a seat and wriggled between the bleachers to escape into the substructure below. Everyone else around me was paying so much attention to the spectacle above that they'd barely noticed my personal fight right next to them. With only the apologies focused to hand, I didn't have anything I could really do to try to catch the fleeing animagus. By the time I let everyone know what was going on, he was long gone. A couple of hours later, finally dry and warm, I was in Dumbledore's office to brief him. Mathilda grudgingly allowed that it was order business and stayed back in the tower, but I figured if I was on a no more secrets kick, I'd have to clue her in on the Horcrux situation eventually. At the rate she was devouring Arcanos books to plan her campaign, she'd probably make the lick phylactery connection pretty soon anyway. Remus had also been invited to the meeting. Dumbledore, realizing it, would be foolish to exclude his first-in-a-long-time competent and trustworthy defense against the dark arts professor from knowing about the main dark arts we were currently trying to defend against. Plus, if anyone had a right to know what was going on with Sirius Black, it was his former friend. Against the cluttered backdrop of old headmaster portraits and magical bric-a-brac, I explained to both men what had happened at the match. After I finished, Dumbledore sat back, thinking. We gave him the time, and he eventually said, "We have supposed that Tom has split his soul multiple times to make these items. As far as I am aware, there is absolutely no precedent. But from what I know of him, he would have been looking to use his murder of the Potters to create another, the triumph over prophecy being a moment of great significance." Prophecy? Both Remus and I asked, almost simultaneously. Ah, yes. I will get to that. Dumbledore looked guilty. I'd been figuring there was something else he'd been keeping from me, based on what Voldemort had said to me back in the Chamber of Secrets. But, and again, this is pure educated guess. What if Tom, already prepared to make another Horcrux with the death of young Harry Potter, lost control of the ritual when Lily Potter's defensive magic triggered and gravely wounded him? He could have unknowingly left a shard of his soul behind, waiting for something to latch onto. They found Sirius' motorbike at the cottage, as if he'd been there, Remus explained. Yes, the headmaster continued, we may never know exactly what happened that night unless Tom's wraith can be convinced to tell the story and it can somehow be trusted, but I've long supposed that Sirius Black was nearby, entered the house, and for some reason then left to track down and murder Peter Pettigrew without even taking his enchanted vehicle. You think he's basically possessed like Quirrell was, or I guess like Lockhart was? I asked. Perhaps. There are few records of Horcruxes at all, and far fewer for living Horcruxes. Those dark wizards that only made one would never place them in a host so easily destroyed. It is possible that the soul shard was maddened by the pain of its creation and drove Black to his current unhinged state, so unlike the charismatic, controlled spy he had been. Well, also, 12 years of Dementors, I added. So basically, we need to exorcise or kill him regardless. Indeed, Dumbledore agreed. I also now have worries about what would happen should Cornelius' kiss-on-sight order be fulfilled. Would the Dementor safely dispose of the devoured shard of Tom's soul, or does some part of the consumed soul forever become trapped in the creature, rendering it impossible to pass on and thus permanently an anchor. Fortunately, my crew was quickly becoming the foremost authority on soul magic in the country. I told him, I'll add figuring that out to our research, I guess. Remus, obviously processing a lot of feelings about the situation, instead piped up with, "You mentioned a prophecy. Shortly before the birth of young Harry Potter, a prophecy was delivered that seemed to indicate that he was destined to defeat Lord Voldemort, and Tom unfortunately learned some of the details. That prophecy, more than the harms James and Lily had done him in the war, was why he sought them out so fervently. Fidelius was our last attempt to protect them as he grew ever closer, but they obviously trusted the wrong secret keeper. I suspect, given the results of his attack, the Potter child could not have been the actual subject of the prophecy. I remembered Voldemort laughing at his own folly and said, 'You think it's me now? Something about birth or rebirth.' The identifying passage was that the parents had thrice defied him, and that the child would be born as the seventh month died." Dumbledore nodded. "And my mother was apparently as defiant a Death Eater as she was a student, and if you're really generous, you can assume I was reborn at the end of July 2 years ago," I worked out. "Prophecy is useless." "Unfortunately, yes. In this case, it receives its power almost entirely from the fact that Tom believes it. But regardless, it still seems to me that events will conspire to have you be the hand that finally defeats him. Thus, I have tried to keep you as safe as I can while not eliminating opportunities you have to face him." The old man shrugged apologetically. "Still seems pretty thin," I told him. "With a war on, there had to be plenty of people that had defied him 3 times, and if you can extend it to me losing my childhood and being reborn at the end of July, who knows how many would qualify. Hell, if it was being tricky with the Latin roots, the end of September might qualify too. Maybe babies born 2 months premature. 7th month, indeed. Nonsense. Well, yes. There was another candidate at the time, even when we were taking things very literally, who was also placed in hiding. And this must not leave the room because this is part that he does not know. Another confirmation was that he would mock him as his equal." I rubbed the side of my chest that still bore discolored marks from Voldemort's creepy wraith fingers when he'd first gotten grabby and tried to possess me. "Fair enough. You could have just told me this before, you know." The old man gave the helpless shrug of a veteran information hoarder, and I just rolled my eyes. I could barely blame him. I also enjoyed looking cooler when I knew something someone else didn't know. Out of curiosity, who was the other potential? Wait, Potter would have been a third year now, right? Neville. After all, his parents were Auras, and we'd celebrated his birthday in late July on our trip the past summer. Dumbledore nodded. Fortunately, the rather well-known apparent death of Lord Voldemort at the hands of Severus Snape seems to have kept the Longbottoms from any further reprisals. When I still had a spy in his camp, I learned he had told his inner circle about the 2 possibilities and suspected they might attempt to finish the job. Right, so Neville is totally safe, since Voldemort has moved on and decided I'm the one he needs to kill now. I said, then realized. Except the shard that's been in Azkaban since the 80s might not know the main wraith figured that out. Both other men groaned, and Dumbledore fished out the newspaper with the vacation picture that Black had seen before finally deciding to escape. I poked my finger down to where Neville was also in the photograph, his recognizable Aura parents right behind him. He's at Hogwarts. Black magic surprising no one. They still didn't manage to catch Sirius Black. While it seemed like it ought to be pretty easy to notice a big black dog with glowing red eyes, chances were actually good that he was spending most of his time in the Forbidden Forest. Between Black's school-time explorations and Voldemort's supposed involvement in the Acromantula infestation, there was likely little there to fear as long as he stayed away from the Centaurs. Rumor was that the only reason the Dementors hadn't been pulled out entirely was because every time they'd screwed up Black was actually in the area. But that rumor came with the side rumor that most of the rich pureblood parents were pissed at how often their children had been put in danger. Lucius Malfoy in particular had come hard at the Ministry over Draco almost being killed playing Quidditch, in addition to being incapacitated on the train and having a near miss in Hogsmeade. He was probably going to leverage that for additional favors in the Wisengamot, but the biggest sign of it was the broom replacement. When Draco had fallen, The winds had carried his nearly new Nimbus 2001 into the Whomping Willow, which had smashed it to bits. Initial word was that the replacement would be one of the ridiculously expensive new Firebolt brooms. So it was a surprise to everyone when Draco just got another Nimbus 2001 and a second one for Ginny. The Malfoys took saving their lives seriously. It wasn't exactly a full-on life debt. Clearly, the number of people on the ground ready to cast spells to catch them played a large role in keeping him from hitting the pitch at speed. But it was certainly over and above what anyone would expect from a sports rival from a family that hated yours. Ginny had even passed up grabbing the snitch to go after the boy. It was especially interesting that he'd insisted on her getting an equal broom when the teams were due for a rematch later in the year. Would Draco stand a chance against the Gryffindor Seeker without a superior broom? Needless to say, Penny's summer conspiracy to turn the Malfoys and Weasleys into the Montagues and Capulets was once again the talk among her, Mathilda, and Alexis. Before the summer, I'd have never believed it was possible, because the last time Arthur Weasley and Lucius Malfoy had seen each other, they'd gotten into a fistfight. But after some initial coldness, Mrs. Weasley couldn't resist her urge to mother literally everyone around her, and she begun treating Draco more and more as part of the family throughout the summer vacation. Draco himself initially seemed to be mostly confused and using all of his manners not to offend his hosts, but had gotten increasingly comfortable with the family by the time the vacation was over. I mean, really, it's not like the families were actually very different, other than wealth and politics. I was vaguely considering trying to arrange for the kid to spend one-on-one time with Hermione's family the next summer for some real culture shock. And hell, maybe if he did well enough with that, he could eventually actually spend some time with a family that wasn't a tightly bonded nuclear unit of upper-class white British people. But anyway, thinking about Draco's relationships, I'd eventually realized that I might have a way to break my final big secret to Mathilda. After we finally made characters for her Arcanos game one Saturday night in late November, I got stuck with Healer because I knew the game best, and everyone else had headed off to bed. I pulled her over to a corner of the common room and had her put up some silencing charms. I'd prepped her that I wanted to try to do this, so I just started with, "Okay, I haven't met Draco's Aunt Andromeda and don't owe her anything. You should meet her. I met her at a party a couple years ago." I see where Tonks gets it. Her mother is formidable. Finally, she seemed to grasp what I was saying, or specifically wasn't saying. I mean, Maeve is supposedly Draco's aunt. Obviously, you've met her. His only other aunt is. Her eyes widened as she got it and asked, "Harry, do you know Bellatrix Lestrange?" I pointedly didn't admit it, because I couldn't, but I showed her the yearbook that I'd checked out from the library, where I'd originally discovered that she and my mother were best friends. Margaret McGregor was your mother, right? Have you ever tried to track them down, by the way? The McGregors, I mean. Probably Scottish, right? Maybe Irish. And maybe that's how she got involved with the she. Maeve may actually be from Ireland. I shrugged and she said, "Okay, sorry, focusing. So your mother was best friends with Bellatrix as a kid, but she died when you were born, right? So you wouldn't have just met her when you were little." I tried a few things until I managed to get out a non-committal. Justin wasn't the only one who taught me magic after I turned 11, but before I got to Hogwarts. She thought about it for a second, and her eyes widened. "Paid a Malu catch you. Bellatrix Black Lestrange is your godmother." I can neither confirm nor deny, annoyingly, I was able to tell her. "So is she hiding in America?" I made a face at her question that wasn't exactly agreement nor negation, encouraging her to think about it. Finally, her mouth dropped open and she punched me a couple of times in the shoulder in excitement. "No, no way. You got straight up Cinderella to the Malfoy ball. You told me your tux would evaporate and you were serious. She's not just your godmother, she's your fairy freaking godmother. Keep going," I told her. While she didn't care as much for the deep academics like my prefect friends, Mathilda was whip smart and probably better than me at detective work when she put her mind to it. If you needed to find a needle in a haystack, she was your girl. So she shows up at some point after you get with your mentor and helps you learn stuff on the side that you might need. FiendFyre. No wonder you knew how to do that. So you owe her, and somehow she's figured out how to do the fairy gesh thing Luna's on about. And then you somehow owe Maeve, even though you'd never met her before the Malfoy ball. Bellatrix is why Maeve is here. Her and your mother were up to the fey bargains that Oliver says we should never do. And you can't tell anyone about her for the same reason you can't tell them about Maeve. I relaxed back into the couch. She'd figured out most of it. It was an interesting relief to finally have that secret off my back. But Bellatrix wasn't one of the Death Eaters trying to kill you. What happens if you know who finds out she's been helping you? Sort of, that she has power over you. Does Draco know? Wait, you said he came with us this summer because he didn't want to spend too much time with his aunt. I thought you meant Maeve, but she must just be hiding at their stupid mansion. She finally just devolved into cursing in Welsh at the enormity of it. I don't really know what to do, I admitted, once she'd finished. Things like this plus being under the doom of Damocles. I have no idea what the ministry would do. She thought about it for a minute, then suggested, we have to tell Tonks. She'll lose her mind if she finds this out the wrong way, more than anybody. But if we can convince her it's not your fault, she could help. After a moment's pause, she added, and we should tell Dumbledore. While I had deep reservations about the idea, the force of nature that was Mathilda Grimblehawk would not be denied. A few nights later, I was back in Dumbledore's office, this time with a much bigger sampling of the Order of the Phoenix. The evening had been scheduled around Tonk's night off, so she was there, along with Remus, McGonagall, Mathilda, me, and of course, Dumbledore. I kind of figured if the headmaster really believed this was important, he'd have invited more people. It was interesting he'd made sure that McGonagall would come, though I guessed she was Mathilda's and my head of house. So basically, Harry can't talk about any of it, because of the Gesh. Mathilda finished explaining what she'd worked out. I hadn't been able to provide much other than the vague suppositions I'd given to the Quibbler about the state of the Vale. Remus and Dumbledore looked mostly like they thought we were crazy. The headmaster had brushed off my fairy tales before. Tonks looked the same, except maybe a little willing to be mad about me not telling her about her fugitive aunt, even though we were getting to be friends. But McGonagall, she believed me. I could see it in her shocked expression. Margaret always did believe in the old tales, the assistant headmistress began. You remember, Albus, that we chided her for it. It was a large part of why she left school when she did, thinking we had nothing left to teach her. And even if you assume that she simply brought Bellatrix into her delusions, who passed them on to Harry, Alice backs him up, at least, on the Lord of the Red Caps they fought in Egypt. What if the old tales are true, and we drove those girls into making pacts with beings that were locked out of this world for a reason? I could see Dumbledore turning over her suggestion, and he finally admitted, I have found it odd that Bellatrix has been at large for over a decade and has shown little evidence of working toward Tom's return. Nor has Lucius, for that matter. And my spy had once speculated that her relationship with her master had soured somewhat. We speculated it was because of his intention to punish Margaret for her defection, but it could also have been that she had found a second master to serve. Harry, Remus asked tiredly, just how many dark forces are trying to kill you or use you for their ends? It really was a lot, wasn't it? Voldemort wanted to possess me and then wanted to kill me. For some reason, Justin had grabbed me in the first place. Bellatrix probably had more interest in me than just owing it to my mother. Hell, Greyback had chosen me to kill to get at Remus. Dawlish had way too much invested in his beef with me. Umbridge decided to involve me in her political schemes, and maybe the Dementors were after me for their own unearthly agenda. I shrugged, helplessly, and suggested, I have a very helpful yet punchable face. She schemes with the problems of my godmother, and the Fae in the hands of the headmaster. I was able to knuckle down on my personal projects for the last few weeks of term. I enchanted furiously to make Christmas presents for my friends. I got dragged to the Ravenclaw versus Hufflepuff Quidditch match. I subbed in for Remus classes another time. We got in the first couple of sessions of Mathilda's Arcanos game. We made some progress on the Sulphur charm, and somewhere in there, I even worked on my actual classes. The seventh-year winter exams were pretty much just a review to check off things they were likely to ask on the newts anyway. My prefect friends were clearly a little annoyed that I wasn't that worried about newts. Oliver was planning to go into Quidditch. I didn't really have a plan, but knew I couldn't get a job at the ministry. So the two of us mostly hung out and slacked off, He would have preferred to be practicing Quidditch heavily, but his players took their end-of-term exams more seriously than he did. Penny's stress level dropped a little when, in the middle of December, she got news that the Muggle government had signed the Downing Street Declaration, which looked like it might finally start reducing the era attacks. But that got me thinking about whatever the She were up to again, and worried that it was almost back to the winter solstice, which they'd used to bring Maeve into the world the year before, cracking the veil and screwing up magical transportation. And for some reason, the second Hogsmeade weekend of the year had been delayed until literally right before the solstice. The weekend we'd normally be going home, not that I was leaving that year, was instead last-minute holiday shopping time. It had something to do with New Year's being on a weekend, so the students were leaving on and returning on Mondays instead of Saturdays. But it meant that students would be out and about in Hogsmeade 2 days before the solstice, which worried me. Especially when Maeve cornered me alone in the hallway between my morning classes that Friday and said, "I take it you finally got Dumbledore moving on the ferry problem." I tried to close off my expression, and she smirked. "Good job. We're not angry. Quite the opposite. I bet against you with your godmother about whether you would get it done in time. If you hadn't convinced them, we were going to have to try something drastic." "Huh?" I asked, dumbfounded that she was thanking me for cluing the Ministry in on their plot. "Can't have a proper conflict if one side doesn't even realize they're fighting," she explained. "That's just terrorism. No one negotiates with terrorists. By the way, this conversation was a secret." She patted me with feigned, smug friendliness on the arm and wandered off, and I had no idea whether she had actually outmaneuvered me again or was just trying to mess with my head to make me think she had. When you still didn't know what the enemy's objective was, it was really hard to counter it. I mean, from what we'd been able to figure out, they were funding terrorists. I was still worried about it the next afternoon when we'd packed into the 3 broomsticks, along with the rest of the students, to get out of the winter wonderland that was the freezing, snowy Hogsmeade. Hermione, Seamus, and Ron had gotten a spot nearby, scrunched into a small table between a Christmas tree and the fireplace, but seemed oblivious to anything other than how excited they were about hot butter beer on this, their second opportunity to visit the town. And probably how sad they were that Neville's parents insisted he stay in the castle while Black was still at large. The noise was overpowering, but that made it easier to be somewhat circumspect. "I think we may have been outmaneuvered," I told my friends. "What do we actually know the She are up to?" It was kind of weird the things my Gesh let me get away with. Anything we'd gotten the Lord of the Red Caps to spill seemed like fair game. "Supplying Muggle terrorists," Penny growled. "Maybe magical ones too," Percy added, "if the Blacks and Malfoys did not totally abandon their old master, but are instead serving to coordinate." Mathilda had explained most everything to our other friends after we went to the Order, and the 3 that had actually met my godmother nearly 2 years prior were a little sick about being that close to the notorious Bellatrix Lestrange. There also were recriminations about why they'd never pressed me for more information, and we realized they may have been under a lesser Gesh since she'd shared information with them as well. "Bringing down the bloody walls our reality," Oliver suggested. "That was a big one. We assume they want back into this world," Alexis summed up. "But how does terrorism help them?" Mathilda squinted at me and asked, "Did you learn something else from one of your sources?" I held stock still. The Gesh could bind my ability to speak or write, but it couldn't seem to force me to lie to protect a secret. Not saying no was the system we'd worked out. "Maeve, recently?" she asked slowly, taking my lack of negation as a yes. She said something about what they were up to. I tried to talk around the problem and asked, "What do terrorists usually want?" Penny clearly bit back her initial anger and drew on the information she'd been researching over the last year, explaining, "They want to scare civilians into believing that their government can't keep them safe to try to force concessions that they don't have the power to get in an actual war. And what if, say, the average British citizen didn't even know Ireland existed?" I theorized. Everyone thought about it for a second, and finally Percy, the most used to dealing with my thought experiments, answered, "There would be bombings, but no one would know why. They would be scared, but would have no idea who to be scared of. And the Ministry and the Iqua until a month ago." I finished. "They didn't believe in fairies." Mathilda blurted out, blanching as she got it. Did we help them? Did we make the government realize there was someone it could give concessions to? I grinned and gave her a kiss. You're brilliant. Oi, we helped. Oliver objected. You darn have tea-kiss us, though. Alexis, who'd been stranded for the night at my house the year previous, when the veil was cracked, worked out the current date. So now the ministry knows who to bargain with if things go bad again in a couple of days, when last year they had no clue. And they had a year to gather allies, Percy added, frowning. Last year it may have just been Maeve, and perhaps a small contingent of allies that came through, perhaps the Lord of the Red Caps and other provocateurs. But now they have allies among the native races, such as the Red Caps. They may feel strong enough to fight hit wizards. Can we just take Maeve hostage? Mathilda frowned, still hating the she-princess. Fudge would never arrest a Malfoy on rumors. Percy shook his head. He depends too much on their patronage. Remember, Lucius Malfoy was very likely an inner circle Death Eater, and he went free. Speaking of, I told him, noticing Minister Fudge himself entering the inn with several of the Hogwarts professors, McGonagall, Hagrid, and Flitwick. The only clear table in the room was a recently vacated one next to the third years. Hermione seemed to realize this and caught my eye. I nodded to the incoming group and pointed at my ear. She nodded back with a conspiratorial look and waved her wand to move the Christmas tree to obscure her small table from the incoming adults. I was pretty sure she used the overly specific tree levitation charm instead of the general levitation charm, because Hermione was always extra. The group of 4 talked for a while, just carefully enough that even my listening skills couldn't make out more than the occasional word from their conversation. Especially since, when she caught me glancing their way, McGonagall fixed me with a stare, shook her head, and made a turn-around gesture with her finger. Presumably she'd tell me eventually if it was relevant anyway, but I enjoyed knowing that Hermione was working as my spy. I wasn't going to get that report soon, though. Long before they'd finished talking, the sound of a horn blared across Hogsmeade, then twice more. One of the middle-year Hufflepuff students, whose name I didn't remember without the defense class roll with her name on it, poked her head in and yelled to the suddenly curious tavern. There's an army gathered out by the ruins of the Shrieking Shack. There was, of course, zero chance that a handful of authority figures were going to keep several students from going out to have a look, no matter how dangerous it was, especially since most of them were crammed into a table far away from the door. It took a few seconds before my prefect friends realized they needed to do their jobs and order everyone to stay inside. I was such a bad influence on Percy. When I'd met him, he'd have reflexively started shouting for order before anyone started moving. I like to think that it was also my influence that had more students actually listen to him when he finally made the demand. Mathilda and I, however, were among the first out the door. The burned-down foundation of the Shrieking Shack was some distance away from the edge of Hogsmeade, but there wasn't really much obstruction between it and the 3 broomsticks other than the gently rolling hills. The large wood that I knew contained the Fairy Wrath took up most of the left-hand side, looking toward the shack, and indeed, an army had sallied forth from the snow-choked trees. Well, army was a big term. It was probably a couple hundred beings, somewhere between a company and a battalion if you were being technical, but certainly more troops than you'd want a few hundred feet from a civilian town and a school. Somehow keeping the snow nearly pristine beneath their boots, the loosely arrayed group was mostly red caps, though quite a few of them were riding wargs, and the formation was anchored by ogres and other large, magic-resistant humanoids. At the front and center, astride a clearly displeased but bridled Lucrata, was the damned lord of the red caps we'd met in Egypt. He held a silver horn in the hand that wasn't holding the reins for his mount, and he gave me a smirk and slight salute with the horn when he noticed me. At least he was keeping his word and staying out of Egypt. Fudge, flanked by the 3 professors, wasn't ultimately that far behind us. I guessed Percy, Penny, and Alexis had been left in charge of keeping the kids contained in the tavern. Besides myself and Mathilda, about a dozen kids had come from inside the tavern, and a couple dozen more had wandered down from the various shops, as well as a substantial portion of the citizens of the town that weren't running shops. I wasn't surprised that the group included Draco and his Slytherin friends. It actually made me feel a little better if he'd been tipped off but had come to town anyway. Minister Fudge, the she in the red ball cap announced. He traded the rest of his attire for armor made of blood-red leather with tarnished silver fittings. We bring a demand, renegotiate, and sign the unseelie accords. They have languished too long and must be amended to prevent the injustices your ancestors perpetrated upon our kind. What do you answer? I saw the wizard in the green bowler hat puff up, but then realized that there were precisely 0 auras nearby. I watched him glance around at the 3 professors, try to figure out how many adults in the crowd were in any way combat trained, and even include me and Mathilda in his calculations. He clearly didn't like the math, even faced with an army with no obvious spellcasters. So he did what he did best, politics. I cannot give you an answer without conferring with the Wisengamot and the Iqua. Can you give us time to understand your requests and bring this to council? Fudge asked. If you have not made your concession in 2 days, the she answered, we will once again crack your veil and upset your wizarding methods of travel. If we have no concession, a turning of the moon after that, we will have to do something grander to get your attention. Understood, the Minister of Magic gritted out, clearly not enjoying negotiating in the face of an army. 2 days, Minister, the she warned, and then a wind kicked up, blowing the snow from the ground into the air and obscuring the enemy Fae. When it settled back down, they were simply gone. It was nearly 5 minutes later before the auras started to apparate in. The Dementors had been strangely absent the entire time.